We are what we are because of what used to be. This is obvious. The past shapes the present. But what is the past? The more I read history, the field of history, the more I realize how limiting it can be. The past was once a complex beast, clouded by fog, too difficult to understand in the moment. But all of the discipline of history is a simple story about that complex past. And the nature of the simplicity, the narratives we choose to tell or choose to create, are often a function of how we see ourselves now, or of what is easily visible to us. And this simple retelling of the past can shape the future more than the past itself, which remains too complex to grok. This can be a good thing or a bad thing, but whether we ascribe a value to it or not, whether it's good or bad, it is an inevitable thing. Anyway, the reason I thought of this is that today's episode is about a book that adds layers to our understanding of our history. When we think back to India's freedom struggle, we think of Gandhiji and Ahimsa and Satyagraha and so on and so forth. But we didn't fight one battle for independence, we fought many. Some of the stands were violent, some were led by communists. In the case of this book, by two communist mavericks who tried to ally with Vladimir Lenin to fight the British. One became pally with Stalin, the other was purged by Stalin. Both were complex characters, and both have largely been forgotten, but not by everyone.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Kavita Rao, making her second appearance on the show. She was here a few years ago talking about her fantastic book, Lady Doctors. And here she is again talking about her new book, Spies, Lies and Allies, The Extraordinary Lives of Chatto and Roy. Virendranath, Chattopadhyay and M.N. Roy were two remarkable figures who fought for India's independence through a variety of means. They were okay with violence, they tried to get Germany's help to fight Britain, and then Lenin's help. They traveled widely, met great world leaders, failed spectacularly, and led colorful lives. Their paths intersected only briefly, and as Kavita puts it, they were revolutionaries in the streets, but reactionaries in between the sheets. Fascinating men with fascinating stories. I discussed Kavita's personal journey in my previous episode with her, so we didn't do much of that in this conversation. Instead, we spoke about her writing practices, her experiences with research, her thoughts on men and women, then and now, and of course the men and women who feature in this fabulous book. Do read Spies, Lies and Allies. It's so gripping. You will finish it in a single sitting, and do listen to this episode. But first, let's take a quick commercial break. Do you want to read more? I've put in a lot of work in recent years in building a reading habit. This means that I read more books, but I also read more long-form articles and essays. There's a world of knowledge available through the internet, but the problem we all face is, how do we navigate this knowledge? How do we know what to read? How do we put the right incentives in place? Well, I discovered one way. A couple of friends of mine run this awesome company called CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com, which aims to help people up-level themselves by reading more. A few months ago, I signed up for one of their programs called The Daily Reader. Every day for 6 months, they sent me a long-form article to read. The subjects covered went from machine learning to mythology to mental models and marmalade. This helped me build a habit of reading. At the end of every day, I understood the world a little better than I did before. So if you want to build your reading habit, head on over to CTQ Compounds and check out their Daily Reader. New batches start every month. They also have a great program called Future Stack, which helps you stay up to date with ideas, skills, and mental models that will help you stay relevant in the future. Future Stack batches start every Saturday. What's more, you get a discount of a whopping 2,500 rupees. 2,500 if you use the discount code UNSEEN. So head on over to CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com and use the code UNSEEN. Up-level yourself. Kavita, welcome once again to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you so much for having me again.
You know, from the last time we spoke 4 years ago, one of the memorable bits that I really remember was about neither you nor your book. It was something you told me about your mom. You said at the age of 75, she started learning the sitar, and I have thought about it often and cited that often as an example of how, you know, we middle-aged people should not give up. There is time for me and for anyone who's listening to, you know, live a full life up to whatever age. So I want to ask for an update on that. How's your mom doing? How's her sitar doing?
Oh, my mom is still, going on with main character energy. She is, yeah, she has progressed on the sitar and is giving performances in her neighborhood. She's traveling all over the place. She's 80 this year, but still traveling all over the place. She's going to China this year on her own, not with me, by the way. And she's doing all kinds of exciting things. And in fact, she figures in this book in the first chapter where, I talk about a family member who asked, why do you want to write a book about failures? So that's my mom, because I kind of send all my book ideas to her to kind of, approve. So that's her in the book as well. So
So, what's been happening in the last 4 years? Like you had mentioned during that conversation, towards the end of that conversation, that we were just coming out of COVID. So you had mentioned that you want to do more work with people and so on and so forth. And instead, you seem to have shut yourself up in libraries and worked on this book. So, what's it been like? How have you been thinking about life since then, and what you want to be up to?
yeah, true. I think I did say I want to work more with people, and I did completely the opposite. So basically, after Lady Doctors, I got a lot of offers from publishers to write about the first women engineers, the first women lawyers, the first women constitution makers. And I just felt that I do not want to be a woman writing about the first women, in everything for the rest of my life. It just seemed like a very sort of, stereotypical thing for me to do. It's like a box. And I was just reading in this space, and I was reading about the Ghadar movement, which is also, it figures in my book, but, not as the main scene. And it's a very interesting revolutionary movement in the US. I was reading about that and I thought maybe I'll write about this. But then somebody else came out with a book on that, a very good book as it happens. And so I thought, I need to write about something else. And I found these two characters, Chatto and Roy. And, in my last podcast, I wrote about my admiration for David Grann, who is my favorite nonfiction writer. He's a New Yorker writer. And I've always wanted to write a really exciting book, something, it sounds really foolish, but something like Day of the Jackal, but in a right nonfiction that reads like fiction, that reads like a thriller. Now, obviously, all historical characters do not lend themselves to this treatment. But when I read about Chatto and Roy, I found that they really led such exciting lives. I mean, in their lives were really, like they say, truth is stranger than fiction. Their lives were really unbelievable. And I couldn't imagine that very few people knew about them. So I felt like I just had to write this book, and this is why I wrote this book, really. So, that's it in a nutshell.
While I was reading this book, I do this YouTube show with my good friend Ajay Shah, who's very well read and knowledgeable about history and all of that. And I asked him a quiz question. And the quiz question, of course, was about Chatto and 1937 and Stalin's purge and all of that. And he had never heard of the guy.
Yes.
And I had heard of M.N. Roy. I was vaguely familiar with the name Chatto, but I didn't know any of this history. And I got to thinking that, the growing up in India, in the Indian education system, the kind of vision that we have of Indian history is sort of a particular narrative in which the Congress party is at the heart of it. Everything is Gandhi and Nehru and Patel and so on, and they get all the credit for whatever happened, and it's almost as if nobody else was fighting. And yeah, one Bhagat Singh came, but isolated incident, but otherwise there was no strain of anything else that we are taught. And I'm wondering whether that was a revelation to you as well, or whether the fact that, as we discussed in our last episode, you spent so much of your life outside India means that the history that you got wasn't necessarily as constrained or one dimensional as the history that someone like me took in.
I have spent a lot of my time outside India, but I studied in an Indian school, so, typical CBSE school. So, most of my history was very sort of very dull and very boring and very Gandhi Nehru centric, and also just written in such a dull way. I mean, CBSE school. I don't know if I mentioned this in my last podcast, but everything I've learned, every little bit of history that I've learned is entirely through my dad. He's gone now, but like, he was a man who loved history and he bought me lots of books and he was very, very Not the typical Indian dad. He didn't care so much about marks and things like that. He was like, okay, if you pass, it's fine. Here, read some books. So, and I owe that entirely to my dad. And now, of course, being in London, I have access to the British Library. So that's another factor. I mean, coming back to these two characters, you're right that, they just seem to have been completely hidden. And I think I may have picked up some information on Twitter. It is possible that there were some threads on these two characters. I honestly can't remember because I think people pick up from different sources, and there have been things written about both these men. And like I said, there are lots of scholarly books, but I wanted to write a popular history that everybody can read, not just scholars. And just to sum this their lives up for the listener who's listening now, both Chatto and Roy had just incredibly exciting lives. They were revolutionaries who were pursued all across Europe, Mexico, the US, and the Soviet Union by, the British intelligence and other intelligence officers. Chatto came to a very brutal end because he was executed in 1937 by Joseph Stalin in Stalin's Great Purge. But before that, he had a really exciting life, lots of romances. He was immortalized in a Somerset Maugham story. He was pursued by the British Secret Service and escaped, by the skin of his teeth. And Roy also had a very exciting life. He founded the Mexican Communist Party and then the Indian Communist Party. He was involved in smuggling the Russian crown jewels. He was Lenin's protege and young man. They both met all kinds of incredible men of the time. I don't think there was a statesman in that time that they didn't meet. They met Lenin, they met Stalin, they met Trotsky, they met Gandhi, Nehru, Lajpat Rai, all of these people. So they just had the most exciting lives. And just from a storytelling point of view, it was like a ripping good yarn, which I couldn't ignore, really. So,
Yeah, and while it's very comprehensive historically, you get the full narrative, you get all the pieces of the story. It is also very readable. And I'm wondering if that was at the core of your decision to write a book like this, not just your mother's questions of why you're writing about quote unquote failures, but also the fact, like as you mentioned in your acknowledgement and at various times during the book, many biographies exist of these guys. You mentioned Nirod Barua's book on Chatto and Sibnara
yes,
Ray's book on,
yes.
M. N. Roy as excellent biographies. And yet, despite there being material on these people, you chose to write something. Was it because, you felt that everything else was academic or boring or not mainstream enough, and you just thought, like, this could easily be a web series? I mean, I would not be surprised if 3 years later there is some grand production being announced by Netflix on exactly your book. And I wonder if that thought, not of a Netflix, but of something that deserved a popular retelling, was, what motivated you to do a book on people on whom there are other books.
Yeah, I think this question has been raised by a few people. William Dalrymple was talking recently about how India doesn't have enough popular history, and of course that became very controversial. But without going into too much of about what he said, I completely agree that India needs popular history, and I'm trying very hard to find that sort of sweet spot between scholarly history, like what Professor Nirod Barua and Sibnara and Ray have written, which is great, but it's peer reviewed, it's meant mostly for the historical community, and say WhatsApp history and YouTube videos. I'm trying to find this place where I can write a book that can be read by just about everybody. And I don't know if you've seen the structure of the book. Every chapter begins with like an interesting anecdote. It does not begin in the boring way of, and then Emin Roy was born in 1880 and, in this district of West Bengal. I've begun every chapter with as interesting an anecdote as I can find. And I have tried my absolute best to make it sort of a page turner. And historians are not supposed to say this because, people are like, no, history must be well researched and scholarly. And I hope that it is enough research to give people an idea. I do say that it's not an exhaustive bio of them. There's much more that can be written, much, much more. And I've left out a lot. And, perhaps some people may feel that, more should have been kept in. But I don't feel in this day and time. I'm competing with Netflix. I'm competing with podcasts. I'm competing with YouTube videos. So my main aim, which took precedence over everything, was to make it just a great story that can be read by anybody and not, taking months over it. So I am not very I'm quite open about that, really. So
No, and I think it works wonderfully well without compromising anything. Like, I did note that every chapter starts with a story. My favorite story is 1910 raid on Aghornath Chattopadhyay's house, and they're
that's a
hiding the
good one.
letter from
Yeah.
Virendranath. And I just thought that was so awesome. Just those passages would make such a, if I saw that as the opening scene in again, a web series episode, I'd just completely be hooked. And the other part of what I think that you have done so beautifully is brought out the human dimension of all of the characters, not just your main characters, but all the other characters. And I was wondering whether you felt some disquiet about, being a woman yourself, being a disquiet with the way these men suffered so completely from the main character syndrome and were terribly callous towards the women in their lives. Like, two of the really fascinating characters for me in this book were Agnes Medley and Evelyn Trent, the lover and wife respectively of Chatto and Roy. And they're such fantastic characters. They are eloquent speakers, and you've quoted them, and we hear a little bit of their voices as well. And I wonder that when you write history, which so far by and large has been by men for men, the actions of men, as it were, that how does it feel? Do you suddenly feel a distaste for this character, that like a Chatto or a Roy, who you might suddenly have gotten closer to, where you look at the way they behave with the women in their lives and you say, oh my God, at the end of the day, just another bloody hypocrite. So how does all that play out?
I'm so glad that you say that you see the human in this book, because I could really jump for joy, because my main purpose in writing this book was to write a book about two very flawed humans. I mean, this book is about humanity. It's about what being a human is, which is to try, to fail, to try again, to have terrible toxic relationships, to be a hypocrite, and just generally all that is, wonderful and also terrible about being a human. I really wanted to show that. So I'm glad that, some readers have seen that humanity. Regarding the treatment of women, yes, to summarize for the listener, Chatto had a long and toxic relationship with a very interesting and incredible woman called Agnes Medley, who was an American journalist and activist. And he was basically a revolutionary in the streets and, reactionary in the sheets. He just wasn't able to live with an independent modern woman. While he spoke a lot about being open minded and, liberal, he was really upset that she had had several relationships in the past. And also, they were living in Berlin at the time, at the center of what's called the Berlin Indians, who were other revolutionaries. And Chatto basically used Agnes Medley as a domestic drudge. He expected her to cook and clean for all these visitors who were always visiting. They had very little money. So he expected her to give him any money she made. And when she started developing as a writer, he was extremely jealous and said, I don't want you to write. And eventually it all ended really badly. And she escaped him. And she actually went to China, where she had a very interesting career as a foreign correspondent. She covered Mao's Long March, and she became very close to Mao and the communists there. So he treated her very badly. And Emin Roy also did exactly the same, because he married an American woman called Evelyn Trent, and she was better treated in the nationalist movement than Agnes Medley, because she was, his wife, and she was a typical Indian wife. She looked after him. She looked after, she helped him write all his articles. She traveled uncomplainingly with him from country to country, and she completely stepped back and completely dimmed her own light so that he could shine. And you're absolutely right. Both of them completely wanted to be the main characters. And eventually, Emin Roy dumped Evelyn Trent and went on to other women and married another woman called Ellen Gottschalk, and, moved with her to India, where again she completely subordinated herself to him. So, regarding, my feelings on that, I mean, I saw this in Lady Doctors as well, right? So many modern men, most memorably Anandibai Joshi's husband, they said they wanted educated wives, but when their wives actually got an education, generation, they weren't able to live with them and, were abusive and behaved really badly to them. So I think it's a thing that we all struggle with. We all think of ourselves as, maybe it's more, common in men of that time. People have changed since then. We all see ourselves as saviors and, open minded and liberal and fantastic, but actually in real life it's extremely difficult to actually implement these principles. So I mean, my feelings, I continue to have an admiration for Chatto and Roy, but that admiration is tempered with these facts. I know that they were deeply flawed, and that, in many ways, they did not consider women their equals, and they expected well, maybe they considered other women their equals, but they considered their wives as basically just, support animals. And I do think, though, that by the end of his life, Chatto had probably learned to do better, because he married a Russian woman called Lydia Karunaskaya, and she speaks of him very fondly. So maybe he had learned by then, as we all do. So, like most things, I don't have any idols in life. All my idols have feet of clay, because in actual practice, everybody is flawed. That's what history is, really. So
Yeah, there are these lovely lines you quote from Smedley about Chatto, where she says, "He is fine in theory, a modern man, but in practice he is a walking lie. He still judges women by her vagina. In fact, a woman is nothing but a walking vagina to him, and he is a sole owner of it." Stop quote. And I wonder about, and the thought struck me a couple of times, I wonder about, just as there is a hypocrisy when it comes to gender relations that these men display, is everything in their lives circumstantial? In the sense that early on, when you write about Chatto, you speak about how he failed the civil services, how he tried then to be a barrister but could not cut it as a lawyer. It was these multiple failures that then drove him towards India House and the whole revolutionary thing. And almost in contrast, another character who comes up in your narrative is Abdullah Yusuf Ali, who is in fact a grand success in all of these, gets into the
yes.
civil services and is used by the British Empire as a counter propagandist to Chatto at a particular point in time. And my thought about Chatto there was that, to what extent were what he considered true and deeply held beliefs circumstantial? That did he turn against the empire to an extent because he was rejected by the empire in terms of not getting through the Indian civil services, not being a barrister? Later on, we see the different mixed feelings that Chatto and Roy have towards communism, where at one point one of them says India's independence is more important, and the other one says, no, communism is the whole thing, independence doesn't matter in that narrative. And then they almost flip and they change as the
Yes.
circumstances
Yes.
change. So, to what extent were they shaped by circumstance, and where do we get a sense of the core of the person? Like, one thing that certainly came out to me as something that is central to Chatto is a characteristic that his father also seems to have had, and we can talk more about that later, of generosity, of just almost in an impractical way giving everything up and not caring
True.
about material goods. So, what would you say are the qualities that are core to them, and what are the qualities that are circumstantial to them, especially when it comes to their revolutionary activities?
I had the launch for this book in Delhi, and Manu Pillai was my moderator, and he said, you should retitle this book Messy Men and the Women Who Run with Them. And I honestly think that it's true. They were very messy, and they didn't have linear paths like possibly, Gandhi and Nehru, though even Gandhi and Nehru didn't have as linear paths as we think. Sometimes our textbooks flatten history. And when you actually read the original letters and memoirs, you realize that a lot of people fighting for the Indian independence had very messy paths and, had one idea and then they thought, okay, another idea. So basically, Chatto, I don't think that it was because he failed the civil service. I think because he was a very intelligent man. He was a linguist. He spoke something like, around 10 languages. And later in life, he became quite a successful academic in the Soviet Union. So, and he was a great writer as well. So I think it was more that when Chatto came to the UK, he had this intention of, he came from an intellectual, well educated family. He had this intention of getting an education. But the turning point was when he joined India House, and, well, rather, he visited India House, which is a sort of hostel in London Highgate, which was a hotbed of revolutionary activity. So at the time, you had V.D. Savarkar, you had Madanlal Dhingra, you had Madam Kama, you had all kinds of revolutionaries there. And I think then Chatto understood, that listening to all these people, he thought, why should India not have independence? And from then on, I think he was pretty consistent. Even when Gandhi and Nehru were arguing for dominion status, Chatto was arguing for full independence. The issue was that Chatto simply could not make any compromise, get along with anybody. He was a complete maverick. And as I say, I don't think we have even mentioned, sorry if this has been all completely back to front, but Chatto was Sarojini Naidu's brother. I don't even know whether listeners know that. Chatto was Sarojini Naidu's brother, but while Sarojini Naidu, took the Gandhian path right from the beginning, Chatto actually was for revolution. And then there was a time he sort of got along with Sarojini, but by the 1930s, he was actually calling Sarojini Naidu a puppet in the hands of Gandhi and Nehru. And Chatto was Nehru's friend initially, but then he completely took against Nehru because he felt that Nehru was kowtowing to Gandhi for the sake of Congress unity. And Chatto was very deeply distrustful of Gandhi. And this is exactly why they have been completely forgotten. And of course, Chatto's death was not discovered until many years later because, Stalin's misdeeds were covered up from the rest of the world. It was only in 1991, when the KGB archives were sort of thrown open, that Chatto's death was discovered. And Roy was, I think, a little more pragmatic than Chatto. So he started as a revolutionary. He was not as well educated as Chatto. He had quite a spotty education and came from, a poor family. He started as a bomb thrower. Then he realized that, and he was trying to muster money for India by appealing to the Germans and by appealing to all kinds of people. That failed. So then he started moving towards communism because he was influenced by the Russian Revolution and by Bolsheviks at the time. And then he was expelled from the Communist Party because by that time he decided that, you're right, they exchanged positions. So by then, Chatto was a fervent communist, but Roy had realized that, the Communist Party in India was tiny. And he realized that only Congress could win independence for India, Congress under Gandhi. So he decided to support the Congress, and for this sin, he was expelled from the Communist Party. See, he just couldn't, he always backed the wrong horse. As his obituary said, he always backed doomed causes. Then he returned to India and he was arrested. And after he came out from jail, he joined the Congress. But by then, Gandhi had taken against him because Gandhi and Roy were complete opposites. Gandhi was a nationalist, a religious person, reactionary in many ways. Roy was a hedonist, an atheist, complete cosmopolitan. So they just could not get along, and Roy could not compromise enough. I feel like he was more pragmatic than Chatto, but he still wasn't pragmatic enough. And I think, for instance, Roy calls Nehru a thoughtless, vain, egocentric, popularity hunting demagogue who is popular amongst congressmen with a modern outlook because his demagogy rationalizes Gandhi's irrationalism and supplies a pseudo socialist veneer to reactionary nationalism. That sort of sums up Roy's views. He thought they were just shallow socialists, popularity hunting demagogues, reactionaries. And obviously, with those views, he could never be absorbed within the Congress. And they were sort of completely marginalized and forgotten. So I don't even know what the question was, but I think you're right that they changed a lot of their thinking. But I think that was mostly because the world was changing so rapidly. For instance, in the 1920s, everybody thought Lenin was an icon, and then later Stalin. And it was only later that people realized Stalin's incredible misdeeds. So, and that communism was just not working the way it was envisaged, really. You know.
Yeah, in addition to the quote you read out about Nehru, Chatto also said of Gandhi at one point, quote, he is unclear socially and knows nothing of economics. He was trained in British constitutional law, and that is always a poison that works in the system of Indian leaders, causing them to betray our people time and again for the sake of British phrases. Stop quote. And while both of these quotes are kind of really harsh, they also contain a germ of truth. And it's interesting that they could only possibly have been uttered by people who were outsiders and could,
Correct.
bring that gaze into, the way they looked at the system. We'll come back to each of these two people. I want to talk about both of them in great detail, but I want to go back to you for a moment and your journey in writing this book.
Sure.
Tell me about what the process was like in terms of how did you do your research. You begin your book by talking about how libraries have meant so much to you, and they
Yes.
have been so hospitable, and I think in the acknowledgements you mentioned the British Library as well. What is the life of someone writing a book like this like? Because the final product that we get is like a page turner. It's entertaining, there is great fun, there are great stories, but when you are actually collecting all of the material, assembling it in your head, beginning to dream the book, what's going on? Take me through what goes into the making of the sausage.
Yeah, like all sausages, it's, very messy. It's bloody hard work. It's extremely unglamorous because this book, like Lady Doctors, was an archival book, by which I mean that I was able to trace members of the Chattopadhyay family. And, the fun fact is that one of the extended members of the family is Romulus Whittaker, the Madras snake man. But none of them had any letters or any memories or anything that they remembered. All they remembered was Uncle Chatto went to the Soviet Union. He didn't come back. They didn't remember anything else. Okay. And many of the people who did remember things had already passed. So it was very difficult. With M.N. Roy, the challenge was that he had written so much. I mean, M.N. Roy wrote over 30 books, pamphlets, letters. There was literally, I think, not even a bird alighted on the earth without Emin Roy dashing off a letter, and all painstakingly archived by his wife, Ellen Roy. So, my challenge was to condense all this into a readable form because for me, my reader will not read, pages and pages of communist philosophy. Okay. And there's tons of that, but I didn't feel like people would read it. And therefore, I had to condense it and make it readable. And this was such a difficult task. I mean, my daily routine, I mean, I should point out that, like nearly all Londoners, I guess I live in a very tiny flat. It's like 1,000 square foot flat which has 3 adults in it, and most of whom, all the adults now work from home. So you can just imagine that, my home is not very conducive to work out of. This is why I acknowledge libraries, because this entire book was written in libraries, not just as a research, not just for the research, though also that, but also as a quiet place to sit in. So mostly in the British Library, and most of this stuff is found there. I think you can also find it in the National Archives in Delhi. And basically just sitting and going through pages and pages and pages of stuff until you're completely sick of it and you never want to hear about them ever again. And in October 2023, what happened was that the British Library was hacked in a ransomware attack. I don't think it was talked about much in India because worse things happened in October 2023, but they were asked to pay some £800,000 as ransom, which they did not pay. And as a consequence, their entire digital system was down. So it was like working in a library in 1920, as in you go there with a piece of paper on which you have written something, and then they go and after several hours later they find the book and come back. So you have to hang around, wait or something. So it was completely, and normally the British Library is very accessible, but it had just regressed to, like, a 1920s Indian library. So it was very difficult, and I feel so grateful to the staff who worked in these things. And for nearly 6 months, it was not restored. So once again, this book had to be written. I had a very tight deadline on this book, by the way. I had a deadline of 15 months from the time the proposal was accepted to the time I was supposed to turn it in. Actually, I had a deadline of 1 year, and I couldn't meet that deadline, so I took another 3 months more. So 15 months and then 6 months in editing. So really tight deadline. So every day you get up and you do I used to get up at 5 o'clock and do some initial reading then, and then do all the housework and try to leave the house by 9:30, go to the British Library, spend all day there ferreting out all this material and trying to condense it. It was completely the opposite of the Lady Doctors in a sense, because in Lady Doctors I didn't have enough material, because it was all women, and their letters and memoirs were not preserved, or they barely wrote any. In this case, in a way, I almost had too much material, because Chatto not so much, but Roy just wrote and wrote and wrote, and so much was written about both of these men. And so I almost had too much material. And one thing that I want to talk about is the structure of this book. I mean, that's a craft question. I always like talking about craft. And I chose a structure where you start with Chatto's death, his very grisly and untimely death, executed by Joseph Stalin. And then I talk about, so it's one chapter Roy, no, then I talk about why the two are important. And then it's one chapter Chatto, one chapter Roy, one chapter Chatto, one chapter Roy, even though they're at opposite ends of the earth. While Chatto is in Europe, Roy is in Mexico, in the US, etc. And I chose this because I wanted to write a book about the two of them, because I saw them as rivals. I don't think that other people have seen them as that, but I saw them as rivals, and I saw them as interconnected and leading parallel lives, though they never met in agreement. And they knew the same people. They both knew Agnes Smedley. Some rumors have it that they were both involved with Agnes Smedley. They say they were sort of rivals for that tiny piece of the pie. And I wanted to write the book like that. And that structure, some people have liked it, some people have not liked it. It's been one of those things. And that gave me a lot of trouble to keep the timelines consistent. And the other thing is that there's so many characters in this book. I mean, so many sort of minor figures, major figures, minor communist figures that nobody's heard of. And keeping all these characters and deciding which ones to leave out was very difficult. I don't even know whether I have succeeded. I have tried, basically. So this was my day, and for 15 months this was my day. I mean, even before 15 months, because before I started writing the book, I sent a very detailed proposal to Westland, which took me maybe, I don't know, nearly 10 months to write and figure out and all. A very detailed proposal, 10,000 word proposal. So once I had that proposal, then I could work. Once it was accepted, I could work according to the proposal. So that's it for 15 months. And I barely read anything in these 15 months except stuff like this. And though I watched a lot of crappy TV, so to keep me going, crappy TV, things like Real Housewives of Beverly Hills and things like that, I watched a lot of that TV to just keep going. So, and probably very difficult to live with in those 15 to 18 months. Family must have been completely sick of me. Mm.
I just want to say, I think the structure really worked for me. And the reason it worked for me is that the alternating chapters, the juxtaposition of these two men's lives worked really well for me, because each individual came into stark relief against what is happening to the other person as well.
Yeah,
And I think that was great. And chronologically also, all of it kind of makes sense, though obviously, Chatto dies a bit before.
sure.
What role do you think the deadlines played in actually helping you to write this? And by the way, your publishers are also my publishers per se, in the sense they've
Right.
given me many deadlines which I've managed to ignore completely. So
Okay.
if they're listening to this, they'll be like, Amit, learn something and kindly don't, teach Kavitha to be as disrespectful of deadlines as you are. But what role did that play? Because I'm struck by, I want to know a little bit more about your actual discipline and how hard it was. Were there hours for research? Were there hours for writing? Or did you spend a few months doing the research and then did all the writing in one go? How did all of that come together?
So, I mean, this sounds very pious and boring. I'm a very disciplined person. I've had to be, or I'm just naturally one. I don't know. And if a person gives me a deadline, I meet it. In fact, I'm usually before the deadline. This book was 3 months after deadline, which I felt terrible enough about. Okay. I'm just one of those very boring people. I follow the rules, I eat healthy, I exercise, I do all these boring things, and that frees me up. I don't know how to explain this. I feel like all creatives, you will know this. The creative mind, while I don't want to glamorize it, but you are always thinking about your project. Everything else happens in a sort of on the sidelines in a way. And because of that, you have to minimize distractions. And one of the best things I have done is cut down completely on social media, because there was a time when I was completely addicted to Twitter and publicizing my views on Twitter and getting into long discussions with everybody. And that is also a function of doing such an isolating job. The reason is because I'm sitting at home. I don't work in an office. I don't have a water cooler. I don't have meet people on a day to day basis. But I realized that I was just becoming, there is absolutely no point to it, trying to convert people's minds on Twitter. It was completely draining all my creative energy. And there was a thing that I started, that trap that I started falling into, that I'm really very important, which I'm not. And that my views are, I must have a view on everything. And I realized that I was falling into that view of, here are my views on Palestine, here are my views on this, here are my views on this small thing that has happened. And actually nobody cares, and everybody has tons and tons of opinions, and I have zero expertise in this. So why not focus on something that I do have some expertise, and try to be an somewhat expert in that. So this is how I sort of did it. And regarding the research, in order to get the proposal accepted by Westland, I had to do a lot of research. So it was a 10,000 word proposal, okay, for an 80,000 word book. So 1/8 of the research was done, and I had the structure. I think Westland really loved the structure. For, it works for some people, what doesn't work for some, but they loved it. And so I did a fair amount of research just for the proposal. I By the time the proposal was accepted, I had the bare bones, and then I just had to fill in the all the little bits and come up with some good anecdotes. And for me, anecdote is very important. I need good stories. I can't just have he said, she said, he said, she said for the whole thing. So I needed good anecdotes. So then I just sort of filled in all the good anecdotes and all the interesting letters and things that I found. And, things like, I knew, for instance, that Chatto was in Somerset Mom, but, I didn't know, like, I went and read the original story. And I knew that, I had knew bits about Agnes Medley, but then I read her original books, and I read the books that people had written about her. So all this sort of secondary research was then sort of filled in. But it was mostly a daily project of sitting every day in the British Library. I feel quite strongly that a lot of people say writing a book and, the muse, and there's a lot of very woo woo stuff written about this. And I am not that kind of writer. I feel quite strongly that the only way to write a book is to write it. There is no other way. And I do find that it's much easier with nonfiction. And I've written one fiction book which didn't do very well. And I've realized that I'm not the fiction person. So I'm not going to be writing probably any more novels, because I possibly don't have enough imagination. But if you give me facts, then I can attempt to sort of assemble them in a way that can be read by everybody. So, yeah, I do strongly feel that, there are so many sort of writing workshops, writing gurus, and I find all of them don't stress on discipline. I know it's really boring. It's just really boring to think that writers are it's just a job like any other. If you tell your boss that you have going to send this in by X date, then just do it, because otherwise I don't think that they would kind of lose faith in me. And I'm not yet at that level like Dalrymple and Guha that I can possibly take. Or no, actually, the better example is Vikram Seth, who has taken years over the sequel to A Suitable Boy. I'm not yet at that level. I am still that jobbing writer who has to do everything. And don't underestimate in the publishing world the value of just not being a diva. I cannot stress this enough to any young writers or beginning writers. Turn in your books, be nice to everybody, go through the extremely painful edits where they will say all kinds of things that you don't want to change, but actually you have to change because they know your book better than you do. And just don't be a diva, just do the work. you know.
No, I mean, I teach a writing course, and what I tell my 2,800 students repeatedly is that discipline is the whole damn game. Writing is really like being an accountant. You just put your butt on the chair and you get the job done. I
Yes.
also tell them, do as I say, don't do as I do. But, to get back for a moment to social media, brilliant that you managed to kind of get off it, especially because in social media, there's no space for nuance at all. Like I was
Yeah.
having a conversation with Manu Pillai a few days back. There was this big controversy about Sati on Twitter, and he's written about
Yes.
Sati with great nuance in his wonderful book, where the British were hyping it up too much and the Indians were downplaying it, and the truth was somewhere in the middle. It was real, it
Yes.
was there, it wasn't as bad as contemporary accounts held it out to be. But when Twitter took those extreme positions, I remember WhatsApping Manu saying, I bet you're not going to get into this because no one is going to accept the nuanced view that they're both wrong and the truth is somewhere in the middle. So my question to you is, how did you do this? How did you manage to get off the Twitter addiction? Because it is something I struggle with, many people I know struggle with, that you just go for the dopamine, you go for the immediate
Sure.
gratification. Like, are there hacks that you use, like not looking at your phone certain hours of the day? Or, how did you find the willpower to be able to do this?
Honestly, I have just shifted my addiction to another platform, which is Insta. I'm on Insta, but if you look at my thing on Insta, I don't have that many followers. I'm about 1,200 or something, which is nothing. On Insta, I'm very clear. I only share photos of interesting historical things in London and, just beautiful things. Just interesting historical things and beautiful things like, maybe parks or lovely scenery or whatever. I attempt not to say share too many selfies of myself. During my book tour, I shared some, but now I've stopped. And just, I mean, I go to museums every week. There's so much to see in London, right? It's the best city in the world, according to me. So I put interesting historical things, and these are uncontroversial and they don't reward that dopamine hit because it's nobody has that much to say. Maybe about four people like my Insta post, which is fine. That's enough. Okay, and it doesn't reward that kind of short dopamine hit. I mean, I don't know, I just stopped tweeting for a while and now I have no engagement, so now I tweet a bit about my book, just in case anybody reads it or whatever, but I don't. For a very long time now, even when I was in Twitter, I have always shied away from talking about political subjects, controversial subjects, and some people have, in fact, taken great umbrage to this. And I have actually got people emailing me after Lady Doctor saying, I loved your book, but why don't you speak out on this and why don't you speak out on that? And maybe I can say this in your podcast quite clearly. I'm not in the business of speaking out and calling out people for their terrible opinions and, quote tweeting this person and say, look what this person has said about women. I'm just not in that space. I am a writer. I write. I'm attempting to write popular history. I focus on writing popular history. And as you said, all social media is so polarized these days, and quite often the truth is in the middle. Okay, not in all things. Okay, there are some things where I'm completely, for or against, but I feel that I'm not really adding anything to this discourse by going on calling out this person and calling out that person. It's also so sanctimonious, my god. I mean, I cannot bear it. It's like, in actual normal life, when you meet people, most people are quite, they are willing to consider points of view, they're willing to forgive you for perhaps a mistake you made, unless like it's a horrible mistake. I'm not talking about really big mistakes like Israel's massacre of Palestinian people. I'm not talking about things like that, but little things. But on social media, everybody feels the need to kind of grandstand, and I'm not into that. Especially because I've noticed that a lot of the people who are going on grandstanding about, and virtue signaling about women's rights have, later been exposed doing all kinds of nonsense, in this thing. So I think it's very easy to talk rubbish on Twitter and not mean it. And on social media, I tend to follow the kind of people who tweet about a particular thing that they have expertise in. For instance, I follow Ira Mukoti on Twitter and on Insta, and she only tweets about Mughal history, and it's so nice. I mean, I'm just so interested in that subject. She knows about it. She's not deluging me with her 500 opinions on everything else. So just an example, really. So I do feel that as I get older, I'm beginning to prize graciousness and restraint in everything above all else. And this is obviously not what many other people feel. They want a more sort of outspoken person, but that's fine. If you like gentle content, you can follow me on Insta because it's all very gentle. If I meet people in person, I quite often speak out about all kinds of things because I feel then it can't be twisted and artied and that kind of thing. But on social media, I've just decided that I think I'm only going to stick to Insta. I'm not really coming back to X. I do occasionally feel a bit, perhaps lonely is the word, to because old Twitter was in a way like this huge gang of people with whom you had common interests and all that, especially books Twitter. But I don't think that exists anymore. Everybody is constantly angry and polarized and shouty and that kind of thing. So I just have tried to find these in real life. I mean, my resolution for a while has been to find these contacts in real life. And in London, I do lead quite a isolated life in some ways, but in another ways, I have joined a number of book clubs. I volunteer at a heritage site. I am a tour guide, so I have joined a choir. I do all these kind of things in person to try to cut down on social media because social media is basically filling a void. You're basically saying nobody in my life is listening to me. Therefore, I'm on social media for the dopamine hit. So I'm trying to get my dopamine hits elsewhere, really. So, yeah,
Yeah, and I think what enough people don't realize is that what we see more and more of on social media is that people are passing judgment on other people, and any act of passing judgment is always and always an act of ego. You are basically saying, I'm more knowledgeable than you, I'm more virtuous than you, and therefore, even though I seem to be passing judgment on the people who pass judgment, I think it just brings out our most toxic traits to the fore, where we are constantly standing above other people. And I often say that, and it's certainly true of social media, that those who signal the most virtue possess the least. And
correct.
I've heard, so many horrifying examples of this about men who are complete woke characters online and have been in incredibly toxic relationships offline, and
Correct.
you can actually assume the worst about someone who is projecting themselves as the best. But leaving that aside, my next question, which you've partly answered, also was about the very difficult solitary nature of being a writer. Like, as you said, when you're writing something, you are in the world of the book for a long time. That
Yeah.
in your head, these characters are going around. You have to necessarily go out a little less, stay at home a lot more. You've, got your butt on the chair. If you manage to get exercise habits together, that's great. Many people don't manage that. They kind of struggle with that. And you mentioned that you've joined a choir and you're a tour guide and all
Yes.
of that. Was all of it an act of intentionality because the solitary nature was getting to you? And how did you think about this? How did you think about the vocation of writing, and then what you need to do to keep yourself sane during that process?
I mean, honestly, I find it very difficult because, unlike many writers, I would say many, maybe even most writers are solitary creatures and they don't mind being isolated. In fact, they enjoy it. They don't mind not meeting people. Unfortunately for me, I think I mean, I don't really like to use these sort of, very binary categories to put people in, but I am mostly an extrovert. I mostly like meeting people. I'm not that much of a misanthrope. I'm not very, always see people saying on Twitter, I hate people. I don't want to meet anybody ever again in my life. I'm not that sort of person. I think I'm quite optimistic. I think generally most people are fine. You know, you may not want to, spend the rest of your life with them, but most people are fine. They're okay, you know. So I have done many things to, and I think I spoke in my last, I went over it in my last podcast, so I won't go over it again. I have moved around the world a lot thanks to, my husband's job and also partly me because I also I'm also quite a restless person in my own life. I had a very restless childhood. So many reasons, whatever. But without going into it, I am where I am, and this is where I am. So many things I do. One is I walk a lot. And this is, of course, a huge privilege because in Indian cities, you cannot walk a lot. I've just spent 1 month in India and I found it, the thing I found most difficult was not walking. Okay, because you can't really walk as much as you do here. In like most Londoners, we don't have a car and I walk everywhere. So walking for me is both a form of transport as well as a hobby or a way of keeping fit. I think most days I probably walk more than 10 kilometers because that is how life is in London. I walk everywhere. I go for a walk just for exercise and then I also walk to the supermarket and then I walk to the tube, and then these days the tube has become so crowded that sometimes I just don't get on the tube or a bus and I just walk everywhere. So, and I find that walking really helps with writing. I would recommend it to anybody. I know it's not easy in India, but if you can walk, do it. Even if it's just around your, sort of building and stuff like that. And I'm not the first person to say this. I think many writers have written about walking and running and the great effect it has on kickstarting your brain. Like this entire complicated structure of the book, it came when I was walking. And then, I stop and I quickly write it in my notes on my phone or something. But walking just really helps me in a way that I cannot explain. It really is sort of the core of my life. And these are solitary walks. So that's when I'm solitary. And then to meet people, I'm a big joiner. Every country that I've ever lived in, I've joined things. So I've joined a choir. We sing not religious songs, popular songs. Okay, it's a no audition choir. So even people who can barely sing can join it. And I'm sort of moderate in my singing ability. I'm not great, I'm not terrible. So I can hold a tune. And we sing popular songs, mostly soul songs from, like people like Stevie Wonder, Aretha Franklin. It's great. I mean, singing is another thing that I think is just fantastic for building connections and also taking you out of yourself. And then I'm a volunteer tour guide at a heritage site in London. Okay. And this I'm very proud of because it's not something that you can just walk in and be. You have to pass a test, and it's called the Painted Hall in London, and it's a beautiful 17th century hall with beautiful murals, and it's all steeped in British history. So when I walked in, and how I got into this was I went for a tour myself and I thought this is so interesting and I would love to do that, talk about history to people who want to know. And then of course I was thinking, well, I don't know that much about British history. I went in and asked about it and they said, don't worry, we will train you. So they trained me, they gave me a script and they made me do many, dummy runs, and eventually I passed it, and now I do that. It's fallen off a bit, but I do that about, once every 2 weeks I go in and, do a tour. And it's really amazing because it's taught me so much about writing. For one, it's taught me that people do not care about dates. They do not care about a lot of names, though sometimes names are inevitable. What they care about is an interesting anecdote to make the person human. It's taught me, I give the tours are all sort of stuffed with this British history, Henry VIII and Mary the First, and William of Orange and all that. And if you just rattle off these names, people get very bored. So I saw how other people were doing it. And then I realized that all the other people who have been doing this for years and have do it really well, they bring in these funny anecdotes, jokes, things like that, involve the audience, ask them questions, things like that. So that has really helped me, I feel, in my writing because I thought, okay, I need to make it interesting. That's the number one thing. If your reader is not reading your book, then it doesn't matter what you're saying in it if nobody's reading it. So that has really helped me. And then I'm a proud member of the London Agatha Christie Club because in my other life, I'm a massive crime fiction lover and I'm obsessed with Christie. So it's a group of complete nerds. Okay. I mean, we are not ashamed. We discuss every book of Christie to the nth degree. We visit places where, Christie lived and her gravesite every year. One of the members visits Christie's gravesite, which is in Wallingford, and lays flowers on her grave. So we do very nerdy things like that. So that's another sort of, place that I really enjoy. And I'm in another book club as well. So, this is how I meet people and kind of just get out into the world and see what people are, talking and reading about. So that's it, really.
And this also explains that one trivia in your book about Agatha Christie and her husband visiting Tel Halaf.
Oh,
So now,
yes.
now I know why you randomly mention Agatha Christie.
Yes, because he uncovered all those things. I'm obsessed with Christie. If I had to choose a mastermind topic, that would be my topic. I'm obsessed with her. I would love to, in a way, in another life, I would love to write crime fiction. I'm just not good enough, let's say. Crime fiction is really hard to write. I also go to the theater a lot, and I also, because London is full of great plays, becoming more expensive these days, but there are still bargains to be had, and that also helps. I go to the theater, I go to museums. All London museums are free, so I go to a lot of museums, and all these things that help you feel less alone and less isolated. I realize I haven't mentioned any writing groups. I do have a writing group, but it's the members of the writing group are scattered, but I have acknowledged them in the book. And I do get a lot of support from them. So let me acknowledge them because they help me. But that's all we are all on WhatsApp. So I get a lot of support from them. Who else? Yeah. And I must acknowledge, my agent, Jayapriya Vasudevan of Jacaranda Lit, because unlike other agents, a lot of agents don't do this. She provides a lot of feedback. And every time I was flagging, I was like, oh, I don't think I can going to meet this deadline. Oh my God, it's so hard. She provided that support, which helps you sort of keep going. And that is very important because I think every writer feels when writing the book, nobody's going to read this. This is going to be a terrible book. Nobody is just going to, sink like a stone. And then you need somebody in your corner to keep kind of supporting you. And of course, I have my family and my agent and even, my editors at Westland. So all these people and writing groups. I do recommend writing groups, but I also feel that some writing groups, like I joined a couple in London, but they were too, I don't really get along with the writing groups that are like, here is a prompt, write about a cloud in the sky, because then I find that I never get anything written that can be published. So I prefer writing groups where you're actually writing your own book, and I haven't found any such. Most of them are very sort of woo woo, and I felt like they would be a distraction for me. So I didn't, use them. Anyway, that's it. That's how to live in a less isolated way as a writer, I guess. No?
Let me ask you a larger question, which is completely out of syllabus because it is not about you and it's not about your books, and
Okay.
so perhaps I shouldn't be asking it at all, but it's something I've been thinking about and I feel like you'll have some insight on. I was sort of at a gathering of friends recently and there was this little thing going around where everybody was asking everybody else, what don't you like about each of us? Tell us. And one of my friends said something very interesting about me, which she didn't like. She said that I feel that you're not interested enough in the lives of other people, which is very interesting to me because my first thought was, wait a minute, the seen and the unseen is all about me listening and asking
Sure.
questions. But then I kind of thought a little deeper and said that, yeah, that's probably true. And I've been thinking about it in the days since that in conversations, how many questions do I really ask? How much do I really want to know about the other person? And maybe it's an issue, and maybe it's an issue with men in general, because I think it's a problem with many men that I know, some of whom might well be on the autism spectrum, but regardless. Whereas, and then today I came across a Twitter thread, I'll link from the show notes, by Ayla, a Substack. It's not a Twitter thread, it's a Substack post. I'll link it from the show notes,
Sure.
where she talks about this experiment she did where she describes a bunch of dates she went on. And what was common to all of the dates is that she's asking all the questions and the man is not asking any of the questions. It's just that main character syndrome that, there isn't that natural curiosity. And I wondered if it was a male female thing, because now thinking about the people in your book, what I notice is that if I look at all the men, I don't know how much Chatto deeply really cares about Agnes to the sense of understanding her interior life, and ditto with Roy and his first wife.
Yes.
All the men seem incredibly self obsessed, and all the women seem incredibly empathetic and making sacrifices and devoting themselves to the man until they reach a point where there is just no point anymore. So it's really perhaps a larger social observation that I'm asking you to muse on, which, all the characters in your book certainly seem to fit it, that men are not interested enough and they don't listen enough and they are in the main character of themselves, while women often perhaps aren't enough in that. Maybe women should be more of that so they could take themselves more seriously and not give so much away. What would your take be?
I have many thoughts on this. You have found a question that I have been thinking about for a very long time, because I'm seeing this. And there are two men in my life, my husband, who I've been married to for, it's going to be 30 years soon. So, as they say, people get less for murder. So, kind of thing. So, he's not going to be listening to this. I can say what I want. Okay. He's too busy. And I have a son. Okay. And I. And I have male friends, though perhaps not people I know as closely as them. I have noticed that men communicate in a completely different way from women, you know, and I hate to bring up that old book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And, when I read that at the time, or did I read it? Maybe I leafed through it. I was like, what garbage, what nonsense, how sexist and all that. But sadly, I'm finding that it is true. I find that men communicate, you can disagree, and it's not all men, but let's just say we're generalizing. Men communicate in a way that wants to convey information, for instance, and they want to stick to the information. For instance, I am arriving in London at 10 a.m. by flight British Airways, and a woman would say exactly the same thing in a completely different way. She would say, I'm coming in and my flight is delayed by 1 hour, and I was overweight, and on the flight they didn't give me the right meal. But then, I watched a great movie and I loved this movie, and etc. I'm not saying that she's complaining, but there's a lot of additional information. And what I found in communication with my son and husband, my son is even quieter than, he's like practically mute, like a monk or something. It's because he only communicates the thing that he feels are important to communicate, such as, I need money, or, and whatever, I have passed with, X marks or whatever. And, I mean, he's very busy studying as well, and so is my husband. So it is very much like that. Whereas when I talk with my mom or my sister, the conversation is all over the place. I mean, my mom will start by saying, I got those laddus that you like, and then finish by, discoursing on, I don't know, God knows what, the quality of milk or something like that. And all that is not because she is, losing her marbles. It is because for women, talking is a way to communicate in a way of being seen, and just like your podcast, the seen and the unseen. It's a way of being seen and also seeing the other person, whereas men don't see it that way. Men are thinking, yes, I have to communicate some information to you, which I will do, and then I will stop. And I have noticed this quite often. I have also noticed that men, as they get older, become very quiet, maybe 40s, 50s. They become quieter and quieter and quieter. And women go entirely the other way, because due to the nature of the world, it's more likely that women are doing most of the childcare. Then suddenly, maybe in your 40s or your 50s, you're completely liberated from childcare. Your kids have left, they can't even recognize you, whatever. And then you suddenly have this second wind, and then you're thinking, now I want to get out and do everything, and meet everybody and find out about everything. And I have noticed that I'm very interested in people. There are certain subjects that I'm not very interested about. For instance, my mom is always telling me, she's saying, you're terrible at asking about other people's children. You don't know anything about what they do. And I'm like, yeah, because I'm not very interested in other people's children. Okay. And she's like, you're terrible at all that. And but I'm very interested in other things, like interesting things that people are doing. what books they're reading, what movies they're watching, what podcasts they're listening to, and any nice travel they've done. Whereas I've noticed that the men in my life are just not that interested. And you're absolutely right. And I think it happens as you get older as well. So, of course, there are also some women who become very reclusive. So maybe we are generalizing too much. But I think this is the general trend of thought, is that, you know, men want specific information and women talk as a means of feeling seen and, just communicating to somebody. So I guess you should have lots of women in your life. I always find that women who give up on their female friendships after they get married or whatever, I find that completely reprehensible. I think female friendship is one of the absolute great things in life, and you should always have it, really. So.
Everything you said strikes a chord, and the thing with generalizations is that there will always be exceptions to them, but
Hmm.
they are generalizations because they're generally kind of true. The good generalizations, which so everything you said kind of resonates with me. And one more question on the same theme: that do you sometimes feel that there is a sort of a fundamental disconnect in modern times, and I certainly see it most starkly in India, perhaps a fundamental disconnect between what women want and what men want, and an inability to communicate and understand this?
I guess. I mean, I see it here in the UK as well. One in every three marriages, people are divorcing. You know, I think we all change, and where the issue comes is possibly when one person is restricting the other person from changing. I think the world is still a very sexist and gendered place. I think in most of India, it's men who are still doing all the going to work, and it's women who are mostly looking after the children, and and then later the elders. And so many women I know have spent their entire life taking care of other people, and when they get to their 50s and they certainly say, now I want to do something for myself, nobody allows them, because by that time they're used to having this sort of person. And maybe I can relate it to something that I've been talking about, which is related to nonfiction. And I've been talking about it a bit on my tour. Worldwide, more men write nonfiction than women. And I think the statistic is, I'll have to check this because I didn't look at stats, but I think the statistics is that 90% of nonfiction is written by men. And I have seen, maybe that's excessive, but anyway, the vast majority, it could be 70%, whatever. Even in India, I've noticed that so much of nonfiction is written by men. And in the top 10 nonfiction bestsellers are almost always by important men. And I have been thinking about this and why that is the case. And I have many women writer friends. And by and large, nearly all of them, I might get into trouble saying this, so let me be very clear. Nearly all of them write children's books. Okay, and I have one, or young adult, and I have wondered why. And I want to make it clear that writing children's books is a great thing. And, I'm not trying to kind of throw shade at it, or, kind of, trying to be disparaging about children's literature, because it's brilliant and beautiful and much needed. But I just wonder why it is that so many women are being sort of slowly pushed into children's writing. And there are many reasons for this. When I thought about it, these are the reasons. One is that nonfiction is very expensive and very difficult to write, because you need access to a research library, and most of India does not have access to a research library, because other than the libraries in Delhi, the Nehru Memorial, where are there any good libraries in the rest of India? Maybe the Asiatic in Mumbai, but not really. So women need to take time off to go to a library. And there's one very famous historical nonfiction writer who, he wrote, and then every year I spend 4 months in the Nehru Memorial researching. And I was thinking, until recently I couldn't have done that, because who would have looked after my children? Now my children are grown, which is why I can do this shit, you know but until recently, I could not have left my children for 4 months and gone to another city. But he did, and he has children too. So who's looking after his children? Wives. So here's the thing: if you have a wife, you can afford to do lots of research. You can apply for grants. Like, for instance, there's a grant American grant where you can go to the US for 3 months, and but which Indian woman can leave her kids for 3 months? Or if you don't have kids, the ones that I know whose kids have grown up, they've seamlessly moved on to taking care of in-laws. So then you have to take care of in-laws because they can't possibly survive with, just a man in the house, their own son. So I have noticed this, and therefore nonfiction is very expensive because you have to pay for the the hotel and the travel and this and that. So it seems easier to just write fiction or children's books or something easier in quotes, and I don't think it's necessarily easier, but it's just easier for women to access. The other thing is that women, I feel, are so diffident about calling themselves experts. You know, and so many men in India who have corporate types and corporate CEOs have written books, but the women haven't written books. And my agent says the same thing. So many women are expert in what they know, but they don't write books about themselves or even write with a ghostwriter. And why is that? I think because women are so diffident about saying, oh, I'm good at this, and I've done really well, and therefore I want to write a book. And this is borne out because I'm always asked this question when I do interviews or book tours or whatever. The question is always, do you have imposter syndrome? And I'm like, but why should I have imposter syndrome? I have no idea why I should have imposter syndrome. No, but because you are not a trained historian. Well, that's true. I'm not a trained historian, but neither are many top historical writers. They're not trained historians. There are some who are, but many of them are not trained historians. So why should I be singled out as the person who has to feel imposter syndrome? And I feel like I must say this to every woman listening to this. I do not have imposter syndrome. And it sounds like a very arrogant thing to say. Yes, I sometimes wonder whether I have done things right. Even in this book, I have wondered whether I have written this properly or whether I've written that properly or whatever. But I do not spend my time thinking, oh my God, I don't deserve to write this. Maybe I should just write a short story or something much easier or something much smaller. And I too want that more women write nonfiction. I don't know how we encourage more women into this. Maybe by more grants and by more support and by more funding. We just need more women writing it because I think women can bring a perspective that possibly men lack. We can talk about all the marginal characters like Agnes Medley and Evelyn Roy and, Ellen Gottschalk that possibly might have been ignored. So that's really it, I think. We just need more women in nonfiction, and we need, people to sort of make some space for them and consider them as experts in their own fields as well. So,
No, more power to you for not having the imposter syndrome. Like, I'll just share an observation with you and then I'll come to a question. And the observation is that practically every woman I've ever asked on the seen and the unseen, with honorable exceptions like yourself, will always ask, why me? Why are you calling me? That imposter syndrome will be there. Not one man has ever asked me that question. They're all like, yeah, I'll come. Tell me the time. And like just today morning, I had a conversation via Twitter DMs with a woman author who's written some 7, 8 books. And she was like, I don't know if I have anything important to say. And I was like, oh my God. And one observation that I've made about criticism from perhaps a low sample size, but I speak to a lot of writers in my writing groups about their work, and I've seen that when you are critical of something a man has written, one instinctive response, which people learn to fight, but one instinctive response is to say that no, I was great. There's something wrong with you that you're criticizing me. Whereas the instinctive response with women is beating themselves up and saying, oh my God, I'm not good enough. I can't do this. So whenever I actually give feedback, that is something I kind of watch out for. That who is the person at the other end and how will they take it? Because men and women often seem to respond in almost diametrically opposite ways.
Sure.
And I think, Shrayana Bhattacharya in her book and her episode with me, The Loneliness of the Indian Women, had this great line on how, the men are full of unwarranted self-confidence and the women are full of unwarranted self-doubt, which is why I keep telling all the women I work with that you just wake up every morning and tell yourself, I am awesome, just go out there with that attitude, and that's what you need to do. And The point that you made about nonfiction and about why women aren't able to write it and all of that, and I'm asking this question in all seriousness, that is one answer to that is women becoming less open to marriage and children. Because I think many people, both men and women, walk into marriage and children almost because it is a default way you're expected to live your life. And I don't think people give a hard enough thought to how it upends everything and changes your life. And I think women, especially in India, bear a far greater cost for marriage and children than men do. It's not even
Hmm.
comparable.
Hmm. Yeah, so that's a very good, such a so many complicated facets to this question. It's really interesting that you talk about, giving feedback and how it's different. And, I can imagine that this must be the case. And let me say to every listener listening, I got myself onto this podcast, at least this time around. My publisher didn't approach Amit. Nobody approached Amit. I just emailed Amit and said, I want to be on this podcast. And this is something that I have been following in, maybe not earlier in my life, but in recent years. If I want something, I just ask for it. And sometimes people say no, and sometimes people say yes. But, either way, I don't lose anything. And I don't want to give this impression, because of my last answer, that, I'm like Teflon and nothing dents me and I don't have imposter syndrome. So therefore, I'm better than all of you. It's not like that. I mean, thinking about it, there have been times when my children was young and I was doing very little except, just staring out the window and then all the grunt work, because, my kids have been brought up when they were young, mostly away from family and help. So it was just the two of us, really. But I don't want to give the impression that I didn't have huge crisis of confidence then. I did, but like Nemo, I just kept swimming. I just kept going. And there were many years when my children were young where I wrote nothing, or I wrote very short things. I kept writing, but I always kept reading. I never stopped reading. I just kept reading and reading and reading and reading. And I honestly think that's what has enabled me to write the books that I'm writing now, because reading is so important for a writer. You need to read other people and see how they are doing it. I read all the stuff written by, Manu Pillai, Guha, Dalrymple, Lira Mukoti, even lesser, known writers. I read them and I tried to see how they were doing things. So I was always reading, and then I was writing stuff. I always wrote for foreign papers and my name's not very well known in India, but I was constantly writing. But I did have huge crisis of confidence back then. And you are absolutely right. Marriage and children is not something to be entered into easily. I will say about the whole having children thing. I mean, I don't talk about these things so much in detail, but I will say that it has both been much harder and much easier than I realized. So some things have been very hard, which I never anticipated. And what I didn't anticipate is the world changing so rapidly. It's completely changed from like 15 years ago, right? And I didn't anticipate that. I didn't anticipate this flood of AI. I didn't even, when I had my children, we had not even heard of AI. The internet was just sort of in its infancy. I didn't anticipate AI. I didn't anticipate that climate change would go to such an extent. I didn't anticipate a whole bunch of things that I had never heard of. I thought parenting would be like my how my parents parented. My parents were good parents, but they were, it was very basic in those times. There was no sitting around talking to you about your feelings. They was just go, get admitted in whatever school is nearest, and then fine. And then, okay, you don't want to do engineering. All right, but you have to do something that brings in an income. Do this. And do it. And then I don't, no long conversations. We didn't even have mobile phones. So there were no long conversations. So parenting these days is very hard. Having said that, how it has affected my writing. My daughter is my biggest supporter. She's very into reading books. She's very into books, writing, etc., etc. And she reads all my stuff, and she has given me so much in a very, how to put this in a very corny way. In it's a very corny way, but let's just say both my kids have made my life much richer. Maybe much more difficult, but also richer. And that is not something to be sneezed at, because my general life, because I've moved around such a lot, I have very few people in my life. I have only one sibling, and she lives in the States, so she's very far away. So, simply from that point of view, they have made my very sort of solitary life much more peopled in a way. And of course, that doesn't mean that anybody else should have children. So, or rush into it. You are right that marriage and children takes a lot of time. What I do though is I have put in certain boundaries. For instance, a thing that I have been doing since I was married, since I was like 25 years old, which I don't think many people do. Every year or even twice a year, for years now, I have been taking solo trips by myself. And I've been doing this for years. Okay. And, I've gone everywhere, literally everywhere. I've like gone to Cambodia, I've gone to Turkey. I go alone. I don't really have any major considerations about safety. You have to live your life. And I have been doing this for years, way before all these, women travel groups started. I love solo travel, and I think it's had a great effect on my writing, because even when my kids were small, my husband used to look after the kids for like say 4 days, and I would just go for like 4 days somewhere, and that would give me a space to think about my life, and is it going where I wanted to go, and where is my writing going. Even if I'm not doing much writing, at least I have a path. And I totally recommend this to people. But a lot of women can't do this because they have too many responsibilities, or perhaps because a lot of Indian men, I know that a lot of Indian men are very insecure and they won't let their wives travel on their own. For what reason, I have no idea. Because, if you want to have an affair or be unfaithful, you can do it sitting in your home. It's not required to, go anywhere. So I've been doing this for a very long time, and it really sort of feeds my brain. And I've always tried to get some time, and obviously the time has increased, from the time when kids were tiny, and I only had like, an hour or something on my own, or half an hour, and then it slowly increased. And I do think it's possible for everyone to put boundaries. Here we all, we share the household tasks, somewhat. My son, from the age of 18, he's been cooking all his own meals, doing all his own laundry, cleaning his own room, doing all that. So I hope that these things can change. But yes, I generally agree with you that marriage and children is not something to be entered upon lightly. And perhaps now, for instance, I'm honestly advising my children that maybe it's not for you, because the way climate change is going, it doesn't seem like a great plan to bring children into this mess, and generally with the way AI is taking jobs. So I've told my kids, I don't think it's a good idea. I mean, of course, they are going to do as they see fit, really. So, yeah.
So, before we get to your book, a final question about the general literary scene. Like, before we started recording, you were mentioning how excited you are by the state of nonfiction today,
Oh, yes.
by the stuff that you read and what's happening there. So, tell me a little bit more about this. Why are you excited? What's happening? What have you been reading?
So I have to admit that for the last 2.5 years, I've read very little, except, all these crappy crime fiction, psychological thrillers, because I just was absorbed doing the research for this book. And by the end of the day, my brain would be completely broken. Even now, I feel like my brain is sort of just limping back to a thing. But one book that really influenced this book, I don't think I mentioned it last time. I checked the show notes for the last podcast. I don't think I mentioned it. It's called The Patient Assassin by Anita Anand. I have been bigging up this book everywhere. Anita Anand is a British Indian writer. So I think this book was not very famous in India, but it's such a great book. It's historical nonfiction. It's about a man called Udham Singh, who was spent 30 years plotting revenge against Reginald O'Dwyer, who is in the news these days because of Kesari 2. He was a lieutenant general in charge who ordered the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, right? So this book is about him. So it's a true story. And Anita Anand is actually, she has family in the Punjab, and some of her descendants, were victims of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And she is not a historian, though she is actually the co-host of a very successful podcast, Empire, by Dalrymple and Anita Anand together. So she's not a trained historian, let's say. She's a journalist. And she has written in this book in such a thrilling manner. It's like incredibly compelling. And I wanted to write that kind of book where like you're just turning the pages to find out what happens to the guy. And again, quite an unknown character, Udham Singh. So I think that book did well in the UK, I think. And she's writing another book about, again, about an Indian character who was a social worker in the UK. So I'm always fascinated by all these people who cross borders, because I've led such a nomadic life myself. It shapes you, it turns you into a certain kind of person, not necessarily always good, by the way. And because of that, I'm always very fascinated by nomadic characters, which is why I was fascinated by Chatto and Roy. So this is one book that I really loved. The other book that I'm reading is a completely different book, and I've just started reading this book. So, I can't comment too much about it, but the first few chapters are great and the concept is great. It's called Rama Bhima Soma by a very young writer, Shrikar, and it's just incredible. It's about the Kannada writers in the 70s and 80s who were very socially conscious, Shivaram Karant, U.R. Anantamurthy, people like this, Tejasvi Udupa, and sorry, Purnadhan Tejasvi, have confused him with somebody on Twitter, which just shows, yeah, exactly. And these are writers that I don't know much about because while I am a Kannadiga, I'm a fake Kannadiga. I spent most of my life abroad. I can't read Kannada, and I don't know much about this because I'm very deracinated. I mean, that's a term for somebody like myself. I'm like a coconut in many ways. And I read this book, and it's written in such a beautiful manner. And I'm only in the first third chapter or so. I'm reading it very slowly. And he's such a young writer, but just mark my words, he is going to be a Guha or a Manu Pillai someday. I just feel like it is so good. And I believe he got the NIF Foundation for that, which is a New India Foundation. And I'm really glad that such grants exist because, it's only for post independent work. I applied for that. I didn't get it. But actually, my work is not really post independent. So, it was a long shot. I'm glad that some grants are coming, but we need more grants. We need more access to libraries. We need all these things. So, these two books, I think, and lots of people I know are writing nonfiction, and there is so much to write about in India. There are so many interesting people and events and things like that. It's just that we don't have the support and the funding to and the material. Most of the material is in the British library or in foreign libraries. So how do you access that? It's really difficult for people to come all the way to the UK. It's phenomenally expensive these days, and have the money to access all these things. So, but yeah, I am still very cheered that such books are being published. I think our publisher, Westland, under the Context Imprint, has published so much great non-fiction and is still publishing, things that wouldn't have been published a few years ago, like biographies of musicians, of, social workers, of, people like that, who are not, film stars and who are not celebs and who are not, hot and sexy and all that kind of thing. So I really feel that it's a golden age for non-fiction in India, and I hope it develops that way.
I often use the phrase golden age when I talk about cinema. I think it's a golden age of world cinema. So maybe it's a golden age of many things. One more question before we go into the break, which is that on the one hand, there is this view that, the habit of reading is diminishing and books are in danger because people have so many things fighting for their time, from Instagram to web series and so on and so forth. At the same time, books are still selling like they used to. Lit fests, some lit fests are, absolutely standing room only, etc., etc. As someone who's written these books, gotten a response to them from readers, and who's done the standard lit festival circuit and all of that and interacted with readers, what is your sense of the world of reading? Like, is it changing? If it's a golden age of nonfiction, is it also a golden age of readers? What is that world out there like when it comes to reading and books?
I mean, I'm afraid reading is declining. I do think so. I mean, most people I know don't read. Most people in my family don't read. Okay, they just don't have the time, or well, maybe that's an excuse. They use the time to do other things. And to be perfectly honest, my own reading has declined very sharply. I in university, I cannot tell you how much I used to read. Like the bulk of my reading was done in university. But then I'm so old that we didn't have the internet, and we didn't have Netflix, and we didn't have all that shit then. And therefore, there were fewer kind of distractions. And I have thought often, like every writer who is writing traditional books, of starting a YouTube channel, starting a podcast, starting this and that. And I haven't got very far with it. And it's not because I'm a snob, because I listen to podcasts. YouTube videos not so much, but I listen to a lot of podcasts. Okay. And by the way, I watch a lot of TV. I don't watch films so much, but I watch a lot of TV. It's a lot of it is British TV, which is fantastic, like BBC and all that. So I totally understand all that. That sometimes you, after you spending the whole day, slogging, you want to just watch some nice pictures on TV. I understand that. I guess maybe writers have to become like masters of all mediums, like say Manu Pillai, who's doing all kinds of interesting things. I'm not very good at that. I'm trying to be better. For instance, when I went on this, like, I have this horror of sharing my face and just grinning in with my book anywhere. I used to find it very cringe, but then now I've realized that you can't find it cringe. I don't have the luxury of finding it cringe, because this is what people respond to. They want to know the person. And so for this book tour on Insta, I happily splashed photos for 1 month. Then I got fed up and I said, okay, now no more. Okay. And I think you have to do that. People want to know the person behind the book, and you have to master different kinds of mediums. And maybe I need to be stop being so snobbish, because I have a son who doesn't read at all. And for me, that's like, oh my God, it's like I felt very attacked for a while. But then I realized that he actually knows a lot of shit. And I was like, how do you know all this stuff? And he said, I watched a YouTube video. And I was like, okay, then. And we were talking about art, we were talking about Caravaggio, and he suddenly kind of leapt into it, and he said, blah blah blah, Caravaggio, he committed a murder, blah blah, this, that, and etc. And I was like, how on earth do you know all this? I haven't seen you open a book for years. And he's like, well, I watched a YouTube video about Caravaggio. So people are getting knowledge by various ways, and who am I to say where they should get the knowledge from? So, which is why I'm trying to write my books in as simple and accessible a way as I can, and try to reach every reader. So I think that's going around on my book tour. I feel like Indian cities these days are so difficult to navigate. Many people wanted to come to some of my events, but they just couldn't, because Bangalore traffic on a weekday, which is why everybody is now shifting to online. So now I think it's going to shift to online. I've noticed that the couple of online interviews that I got were seen by some 5,000 people. So perhaps less in person. I do think that a very sad thing is happening to Indian cities. I can see it perhaps because I'm not living there right now, which is that everything is going online. And everything is, and innovation is getting your groceries in 10 minutes, 9 minutes, 8 minutes, 7 minutes. But all the public infrastructure has been destroyed. So people don't want to move beyond their own narrow localities, and everything is online. And I really find that quite sad, because I hate online. I always prefer meeting people in person, but I'm just going to have to get used to it. I'm just going to have to lump it and get used to online platforms, really. I think all writers are going to have to get used to online platforms. All writers are going to have to learn to podcast and appear on YouTube videos and market. I mean, marketing is a dirty word for many writers, because the so many people have told me, well, if your book is good, then why does it need marketing? And I don't know how to answer this, because nobody ever says, well, if the iPad is good, why does it need to be marketed? Or if a packet of chips is good, why does it need to be marketed? And I'm not saying my book is like a packet of chips, but everything needs to be marketed. But talking about response, Lady Doctors really did very, very well. and it's still doing well. In fact, when I went to all the bookshops, people were like, "Will you please sign Lady Doctors?" And I'm like, "No, but I have a new book out," and they're like, "Yeah, yeah, but Lady Doctors, please sign for me." So I did sign it. Lady Doctors is still selling. On Goodreads, there are at least 1,000 people who have marked it as something they want to read. It's still selling. It touched some kind of chord that I did not expect it to touch. And I have got umpteen emails from doctors, from non doctors who just were very moved by it. And to all of them, I'm going to say, please read the new book because it also has many moving themes, and it also has women, and it also has, difficult men. So it's not dissimilar in that way. So,
No, no, Little Doctors moved me a lot as well. One story I keep coming back to is Haimabati Sen, which is such
yes,
to begin life in that manner and then to come out of it is just something
true,
so unimaginable to me. It
true.
doesn't feel real at all. And I share your lament about cities. Earlier you were talking about your 1,000 square foot apartment in London. So let me tell
Hmm.
you, I stay in a 1,000 square foot apartment in Bombay, except that I don't have a library where I can sit and work, and I cannot walk
Sure.
outside because the AQI is like whatever, a few hundred
Absolutely.
points
I'm
or
still
whatever.
doing good.
So
Yeah. But
yeah, yeah.
I'm still doing good, except, of course, children, adult children. The state of the world these days is so much that, I wanted to say most of us are going to end up living with our adult children far longer than we did with our parents, than we envisaged. And that in itself is a whole different adjustment game. So think about that as well. So,
Looks like I dodged a bullet. So yeah.
yeah.
Let's take a quick break, and on the other side of the break, jump into the past.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hey, the music started and this sounds like a commercial, but it isn't. It's a plea from me to check out my latest labor of love, a YouTube show I am co hosting with my good friend, the brilliant Ajay Shah. We've called it Everything is Everything. Every week, we'll speak for about an hour on things we care about, from the profound to the profane, from the exalted to the everyday. We range widely across subjects and we bring multiple frames with which we try to understand the world. Please join us on our journey and please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. The show is called Everything is Everything. Please do check it out. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm still chatting with Kavita Rao, who has been patient enough to write many books. She is, of course, patient enough to do a couple of episodes with me as well, no matter how long they take. Let's start talking about the two fascinating protagonists of your book. And I really want to start with Chatto because to begin with, I found the family fascinating. You, of course, mentioned that he's
True.
Sarojini Naidu's brother. She was the eldest of many children. Equally, Harindranath Chattopadhyay, who artist and poet, was another of his brothers. His wife, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, also plays a part in this. In fact, Harindranath, was mentioned by a previous guest of mine just 3 episodes ago. Prahlad Kakkar once shot a commercial where I think he did the voiceover. So,
Yeah.
but the most fascinating person, in this entire family to me is really the father, Aghornath, about whom
Yes.
Sarojini Naidu once said, "My father is a dreamer, a great man whose life has been a magnificent failure. I suppose in the whole of India there are few men whose learning is greater than his, and I don't think there are many more beloved." Now, one doesn't know about the beloved part or the learning part, but certainly great dreamer, magnificent failure. This kind of fits his son also. But tell me more
Yes.
about Aghornath and how you read up on him, what you discovered about him, how he became real to you.
Yeah. So yes, my protagonist Virendranath Chattopadhyay was Sarojini Naidu's brother, and he came from the, very large and intellectual Chattopadhyay family, who all grew up in Hyderabad because Aghornath Chattopadhyay, while he was a Bengali, he actually, after studying in the University of Edinburgh, he moved to Hyderabad where he became principal of Nizam's College, and they all grew up there in what's now called the Golden Threshold. And in fact, just about 2 weeks ago, I gave a talk in the Golden Threshold, which still exists. It's now part of Hyderabad University. So, again, a very intellectual and very genteel upbringing. So, because Agonath was very well read, very well educated, he educated all his children. And Sarojini was the eldest girl. My protagonist, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, was the eldest boy. And in that, 8 siblings, they also had Harindranath Chattopadhyay, who became a very famous poet and general, man about town, Renaissance man, you could almost call him. And Suhasini, who married ACN Nambiar, who was rumored to be a spy and was very high up in Indian intelligence, and Mrinalini, who headed a proper popular girls' college. So all of them were very accomplished, highly educated, well read, all that, and also very cosmopolitan. I mean, Sarojini says something in the book which I think, really describes who Chatto was at all. She says, my beloved father said, be not limited ever to Indians, but let it be your pride that you are a citizen of the world. And this is what Chatto did, He became sort of a global nomad in the days before, there were global nomads. And he was a citizen of the world. He was an incredible linguist. He spoke, all kinds of Indian languages: Bengali, Telugu, Hindi, Urdu, English. He learned French, Russian, Dutch, Italian, Swedish, everything. And he was a true cosmopolitan. He did not really believe, in the communal politics of the time. And I can assume it's because he learnt it from his father. And yes, magnificent failure. His father, Agornath Chattopadhyay, started life quite well off. And by the end of his life, he had fallen upon hard times because he had given away all his money to various good causes. And he was always amassing these sort of addas full of intellectuals who would come and talk about ideas and new things and new developments and science and religion and things like that. And that is what Chatto did as well. So, in a way, he too was a magnificent failure in the sense that by the end of his life, he had become completely marginalized. He was living in poverty. But he lived with so much passion and conviction. And in a way, as I say quite often in the book, he was one of the first cosmopolitans, even before Nehru, who we think of as a cosmopolitan. Chatto and Roy were cosmopolitans, really. So,
And I also, one theme that I've been wondering about recently, and I'm working on a larger project on this, on fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, and so on and so forth. And something that I didn't expect to find to the extent I found it, and that I was very surprised by, is that so many men eventually turn into their fathers. They might say otherwise, they might not admit it to themselves, but they just do.
true.
It just happens. Like there's a beautiful quote here where Agornath, before he dies, he tells Harindranath, one of the other sons, remember that I am leaving a great heritage for you, not wealth, not houses, not lands. I'm not leaving a penny for any of you, but I am leaving you a wonderful thing, a life of culture and a life of struggle. Thank God I have been able to leave you with a brain and intellect, knowledge, and I hope a really honest and upright heart. And this aspect that he doesn't care about money, but he does care about culture and learning, both of these are,
Yes.
things that we see in Chatto. What we also see in Chatto is an almost impractical political will sometimes, because what happened with the father
Yes.
in Hyderabad, as you point out, is that he was in this very cushy post where he's a principal of Nizam College, but then he gets involved in some minor political dispute which a sensible person would
True.
just say, hey, don't even bother, it's not worth it. But he gets
True.
kicked out of Hyderabad for that, and a few years pass till he can come back because he
Yes.
just can't stop himself. And it's a similar thing with Chatto also, right? He goes in all kinds of directions because he just can't stop himself. His convictions take him there, and he just kind of
Yes.
goes with that flow. So I'm not asking just about these two people, but also about these two people, specifically about Chatto. But in your readings of history, when you look around you, do you see that there is something to this, that there is often this kind of part dependence to the family that you're born in, and that so many men often spend their lives trying to chase a dream that, in a certain sense, was a continuation of their father's dream, as it were?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have turned into part of me is very much my father. A small part of it is my mother, but I think I'm mostly my father. So, probably not a good thing for those around me. So yeah, you do, you always, you start life saying, I will never be like my father, I will do everything differently, I will never be like my mother. And you do exactly the same things. And you also con yourself, I'm going to be the best parent there ever was. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. I'm not going to say this and I'm not going to say that, and etc. etc. And then you make a whole bunch of mistakes. maybe different mistakes from what your parents made, but still mistakes. And getting old is very humbling that way. You just sort of realize that you're just exactly like what came before you. And yeah, I don't know about history and people turning into their fathers. I don't know that I'm qualified to speak about that. But yes, Chatto certainly was exactly like his father. He had only one suit. He lived in complete penury. He didn't care about possessions. But what where he went wrong was also using Agnes Midley resources and taking money from her, and expecting her to cook and clean behind him. But still, nevertheless, he led a very precarious life, and he needn't have done that, at least initially. The later, though, he didn't have a choice because he was so pursued by the police, he was wanted by the police, that he did not have the choice to return to India. And I think even Harindranath, when he writes about him, he does say that Chatto was sometimes quite naive. And there was that incident where Chatto was promised money by the Germans, and he rushes off to Switzerland to meet them. And actually, it was a trap set by the British Secret Service. And that chapter is called "A Dagger, a Revolver, and a Bottle of Chloroform," because that's what they had in the car, and they were going to assassinate him. The British Secret Service had a contract to assassinate Chatto, and he just fell into this trap and escaped because the Swiss police then intercepted the car. So this was very naive on Chatto's part. He assumed that just because he supported Indian independence, everybody else would also support it. So he was very naive that way, in a way that possibly even Agornath was, in which he sort of rushed headlong into things and didn't consider the consequences. But then that is why that made him what he is. And without being that person, without being willing to take such risks, he would not have been Chatto. He would have been just someone else, really. So
There's a great line in your book about how I think when Harindranath comes to meet him in Berlin, he realizes that his brother is wearing a suit which probably hasn't been ironed for a long time and has never known a crease in its life, something like that, or never known a crease for
yeah,
years, which
yeah,
kind of indicates how he didn't care about material things or outward appearances and was just in
right.
the world of ideas. Tell me about the shaping of the young Chatto. Like early on, it's not that he's always a rebel and a rebel only. He does, after all, go to London wanting to join the civil services,
Yes.
wanting to be he takes a shot at trying to be a barrister after that. Tell me about the shaping of his and how he gradually moves into the revolutionary direction. Because on the one hand, it would seem that there is a happenstance that while he is in London, he fails in doing those things, and he stumbles upon India House, where he gets under the influence
Yes.
of Savarkar and Madam Kama and Shamji Krishna Verma and others, which you've detailed so well in the book.
Right.
But so what's happening with him? Take me through his journey.
So the young Chatto arrives in London, and he visits India House, which, by the way, is not to be confused with the Indian Embassy, which is also called India House, which is in Holborn. This is in Highgate, North London. And this was a hostel started by a man called Shamji Krishna Verma, who was basically a revolutionary at heart. And he believed in complete independence from India. And of course, at that time, they were the moderates held sway in the Congress. They were pleading only for dominion status. And this man, Krishna Verma, believed in complete independence for India and just became more and more radical and brought more and more radicals to the house, one of whom was V.D. Savarkar. So, when I spoke about this at a book launch, people got very furious at the mention of V.D. Savarkar, who is, of course, now a very controversial figure. But I should clarify that this Savarkar in this book is early Savarkar. And from what I could tell, he is not very Hindutva when he is very young. He is mostly speaking only about independence for India, which in those days was a very radical thing to say. Right. And Chatto and Savarkar were actually seem to have been very close friends when Savarkar was used to give fiery speeches calling for, we must all die for Dharma, and to, throw out the Englishman, from India, and etc. And Savarkar is widely known to have also influenced Madanlal Dhingra, who later killed a British official. And, behind the scenes, everybody knew that Savarkar, was influential. And then, of course, Savarkar escaped in a very sort of dramatic way, because he was arrested and then he was taken in a ship, and on the way he escaped from a porthole of the ship, and but he ended up in landed on the French coast, but because he didn't speak French he was again sort of apprehended. And Harindranath Chattopadhyay describes this with very sort of in a very exciting way. And a lot of people, when I was giving my talk at this in Hyderabad, a number of people felt that I was supporting Savarkar in some way, which I'm not, because this book just deals with a tiny bit of Savarkar that in when he first came to the UK. And at that time, Chatto, despite being a very secular person, was very good friends with Savarkar. There's no denying that. He visited Savarkar in prison, and he was very influenced by him. He then decided to quit his legal studies and his civil service preparations, and he went to Paris, where he met Madame Kama, who was again completely in favor of Indian independence, a radical, as in contrast to the moderates like Motilal Nehru and Jawaharlal Nehru and all of those. So this is how Chatto was greatly influenced. And I say in the book that I think it was because so many of these revolutionaries saw how British people had full freedom of speech and they could write what they wanted, and they decided that we too want the same thing. And in fact, many of the letters were published in the Times, because in India they might have been persecuted, but in the Britain they had a slightly more leeway. Not entirely, because once these assassinations happened, once again the British police tried to arrest them and they had to flee. So I think this is what he was very influenced by, that all these, sort of robust nationalists and radicals, and several, all of whom possibly deserve a book to themselves. So this is why what he was influenced by back then.
Yeah, I mean, I've done an episode on Savarkar with Vinayak Chaturvedi, who wrote about him, and I've read all the books on him. And one interesting thing not enough people realize is that if Savarkar was to die somehow in 1910, today he would be remembered the same way Bhagat Singh is, or the same way Madan Lal Dhingra is, perhaps, and nothing else. Hindutva stuff comes much later, after years of torture in the
It
jail.
comes later.
So
Yeah, it comes later.
it
Yeah.
comes later.
So
I'm also wondering about the ideological shaping of Chatto in this time, because there are a couple of ways in which India House sort of marks an extreme departure, in the sense that what is happening in the Congress is that, yes, there is a sort of a battle between the moderates and the extremists, but as James Keir Hardy once said, the moderates are extreme in their moderation and the extremists are moderate in their extremism. They aren't really that far apart. Whereas
yeah,
the India House folks are really far apart, that they are advocating violence. Like in your book, you quote
yes,
Madan
yeah,
Lal Dhingra when he's on the dock. He says, quote, "If it is patriotic in an Englishman to fight against the Germans if they were to occupy this country, it is much more justifiable and patriotic in my case to fight against the English. I hold the English people responsible for the murder of 80 million of Indian people in the last 50 years, and they are also responsible for taking away £100 million every year from India to this country. It is perfectly justifiable on our part to kill the Englishman who is polluting our sacred land." And I'm interested in how this affects the discourse and what's happening around this, because traditionally now when we hear about those times, we see a very genteel discourse happening, where on the one hand the moderates in the Congress are saying that let us give petitions and let us talk to the British, and no one's asking for independence, and even the so-called extremists like Bal Gangadhar Tilak aren't going anywhere near as far as the India House folks are.
yeah,
And
yeah,
we generally in our schools and in our history books, we don't learn about this strain of the freedom movement, as it were. But there was a lot
yes,
of discourse around this, as you point out. When Madame
yeah,
Kama went to Paris, she started a paper called Bande Mataram. Chatto started a paper called Talwar, and at
yeah,
various times papers are coming, pamphlets are being written, propaganda is happening.
true.
This is a fairly popular strain of thinking among a certain kind of person. So tell me a bit more about this.
Yeah, I mean, in India House, they were calling for violent revolution. Okay, Krishna Varma was very clear. And in fact, when there were two women who were killed, two innocent British women who were killed as a result of a bomb throwing, he defended it. In the pages of the Times, he says, supposing for argument's sake that they were killed deliberately, it would only prove that those who habitually live and associate with wrongdoers or robbers, and he means Englishmen by this, do so at their peril. And initially, Chatto is very alarmed by this, and he says that a true nationalist believed in peaceful resistance. But he changes, and Krishna Varma believed that Chatto only said was only moderate because he was scared of being arrested by the British. But then once he fled to Paris, he becomes increasingly more radical. Okay, once he escapes the Britishing, he becomes, increasingly more radical. And in Talwar, he writes very quite strongly that it's time to move to anarchy. Okay, he is moved beyond peaceful, resistance and things like that. Okay, so I guess by around this time, no, well, this is still 1911, but by 1914, Jallianwala Bagh had happened, right? So I assume people just became more and more radical. And Madame Kama herself was very radical. Plus, in Paris, Chatto was meeting all these Egyptian nationalists and, colonized nationalists, all of whom by then were like sick of colonization. And we're talking quite bravely and, clearly that we need violent revolution, you know and of course not everybody thought that Chatto had any common sense, because British police say of Chatto at this time he's full of imagination like many Bengalis, and was continually propounding elaborate schemes for revolution which were not of the slightest practical value. As Madame Kama sometimes said of him, he was all talk and no work. And there was a huge amount of dissension between all these revolutionaries. Everybody had a different view on how things should be done. And that, of course, is the curse of India, right? We can never sort of pull together. There always have, a million different opinions. So I think that is where the sort of influence came in from all these other very radical nationalists, and also from Italian nationalists, because that was the time of Garibaldi, Mazzini, and also from Egyptian nationalists and other, nationalists all wandering around in Paris at the time. So,
Much later in his life, when his debates with Nehru happened between 1927 and 1930, and they kind of fall apart, Nehru at one point writes this letter, which you've reproduced in your book, where he essentially accuses Chatto of being out of touch with what's happening in the country. Like, Nehru's sense is, look, we are
yes,
the people who are in the country and we are dealing with the government every day, and we know the ground reality, and these buggers are just sitting
sure,
outside and giving gyan and giving lectures, and they don't really know
true,
what's going on. Now, this book is essentially about two guys who, for this entire period,
right.
Roy for 16 years and Chatto for a lot of this time, were outside the country. And to what extent do you think that that affected the way that they looked at the country? Because on the one hand, the outsider can have a clear gaze because there are certain things they haven't normalized, and you can zoom out and you can see things which may not be clear on the ground. But at the same time, you miss the moving current of events which are happening in a particular place, and therefore you can actually be hopelessly out of touch and impractical, and what you say may cease to have relevance. So what is your sense of the effect that the distance and the travel had across these dimensions?
My sense is that Chatto was very out of touch. Okay, because he was so sort of, anti Gandhi, anti Nehru, anti any compromise with the British. I think he completely lost touch with the delicate negotiations that were going on for British independence, which were one step forward, two steps back, one step forward, two steps back. And he completely lost touch. And in his letters with Nehru, I am quite sympathetic towards Nehru, because Chatto is basically telling Nehru, just, move to be president of the Congress, dump Gandhi, he's just using you, and you move to be president of the Congress, and then you can be properly socialist instead of this sham socialist, because Chatto believed that the Congress was basically a party of, banyas and big businessmen and zamindars, and he wanted it to be more in tune with the common peasant. There is something to be said for that as well. But Nehru, of course, took completely umbrage at this. And after that, their relationship never recovered. And Nehru just forgot about Chatto because he didn't want to be lectured by Chatto on what was happening in India. And I do believe that Nehru was right, because the Communist Party in India at that time was completely fledgling and tiny. It had no power at all. And it was only Gandhi, before Gandhi, we were all sort of divided. And it was only Gandhi who had the charisma to unite all of India, the north, the south, the east, the west. I mean, if you talk to anybody of that time, you know, even say, for instance, my mother and all that, who was born just before independence, and my father, everybody saw Gandhi as the leader. He united the country. And when I talk about this, people are going, "Oh, why are you eulogizing Gandhi and Nehru?" I'm not. I'm just saying that, Chatto and Roy were not skilled in party politics. They were not skilled in party maneuver. They were very impractical, and they were not able to carry their message, being abroad for so many years, to the whole of India. So I think in Chatto that way was very out of touch. Roy, I feel, was slightly more practical because he was a diehard communist until about 1930, when he realized that communism is tiny in India. We cannot possibly fight for independence under the communist banner. So he said that everybody must support Nehru. In private, he had a very poor opinion of Nehru, which I've already read. He thought he was vain, a demagogue, etc. But he did realize that the Congress is the party that will take India to independence. And he, in fact, he joined the Congress. He became a lapsed communist. So he was way more practical in terms of what is happening on the ground. But then he eventually had to leave the Congress because he wasn't skilled in party politics enough for the Congress. He wasn't willing to compromise. And eventually, Roy starts the radical humanist movement, which he calls, Royism. And that is a very impractical movement in every way. I don't think anyone can disagree. It's very attractive, and many of us might like to be, follow Royism, but it's just impossible in a country like India. So, yeah. So they were both out of touch, I would say, one more than the other.
You've published a beautiful letter by Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay in The People in 1928, where she talks about champagne socialism. And she writes,
Yeah.
Indians abroad fail to see that these communist friends are usually those who have either no opportunity of becoming capitalists and thus convert a disadvantage into a virtue, or bourgeoisie who play the superficial role of the communists as a sort of recreation or amusement. Stop quote. And I love the quote, and it has so much resonance even with present times. And perhaps in a sense it is, maybe she's snarking at Chatto himself having failed to be part of the
Sure.
ruling class, as it were, by passing the ICS or whatever. But give me a sense here of how valid do you feel are her criticisms of these champagne socialists, as it were? Because we've spoken earlier about how the directions that the lives of Chatto and Roy took were shaped a lot by circumstance, that you change the circumstance a little bit and they land up in completely different places. But at the same time, as you pointed out, there is something essential to their character. They are who they are. So what is your sense when you kind of look at them? Are they champagne socialists? Are they impractical dreamers? Are they true believers who are just floundering because of the vagaries of time? What is your sense?
I think a mix of all these things. I think they were very complicated. I wouldn't go so far as to call them champagne socialists. I think they lived by their principles. They lived in real penury. They really suffered and struggled. And, there was a time when Roy could have entered the Congress because after he was released from prison, Jawaharlal Nehru welcomed him. And there was an incident where this just shows the way Roy just could not compromise on anything. That in itself makes him very communist. Gandhi asked him to ask Roy to join him in prayer at the prayer ground. And of course, every single person, every single Indian would just go along. Yeah, let's do one puja. But Roy, being the complete atheist and, a rebel that he was, said, no, I cannot come for the prayer. And after that, again, their relationship never recovered because Gandhi is like, this man will not bend. And in fact, he even tells Roy, why don't you just observe the independence movement from afar? There's no need for you to, worry your pretty little head about it. I mean, not those words, but. And so I feel like Roy if he could have compromised many times, but he didn't want to, because I do think that they weren't champagne socialists. I think they actually believed that if the Congress takes over, big business, banyas, zamindars will take over, the common peasant may be forgotten. And I think perhaps I'm one of those most reviled people on social media. I'm finding myself becoming increasingly centrist. as life goes on. Okay, in a way that I am not, I don't think communism has worked well anywhere in the world. Okay, one could make an argument for Kerala. Okay, but generally, and I also don't think unbridled capitalism, the way we are living now, has worked. Okay, I find myself completely shocked by the inequalities that you have in India these days, and all the figures bear me out. Latest figures show that it's 1% of us who are surfing on the other 99%, right? And in there, I think Chatto and Roy had such a valid point, because they believed that the Congress's socialism was a sham socialism, and that eventually big business would take over, and that's what has happened, really. I don't know whether some of their more impractical ideas would have worked. Okay. And of course, we know that Roy, was became completely disillusioned by communism after he saw Stalin's excesses, and he started believing in complete individualism as opposed to collectivism. So they kept changing their minds. And I've been asked this question many times before, and somebody asked this question. They said, if Chatto and Roy had been, if Chatto had survived, and if Chatto and Roy had been given arms, and if he had been given money, do you think the independence movement would have taken a different turn? And I do not think so. I do not think so. I think we would only have got independence, as Roy said, with the Congress and under Gandhi with all his faults. That was the only way we could have got independence. But perhaps if they had survived and not been so marginalized, for instance, Roy wrote a draft of the constitution which B.R. Ambedkar, used for his own draft of the constitution. He relied on it. So they did have quite a lot of influence. I mean, talking about some of the influence that they had, which was not acknowledged. For instance, Chatto was one of the co-founders of an organization called the League Against Imperialism with Willy Munzenberg. And this was sort of a League of Nations for the colonized people, because the League of Nations was all the colonizing powers, like the UN today. The entire Security Council is made up of the US, the UK, France, Germany, all the colonizing powers. And Chatto felt that the colonized nations, India, African countries, Egypt, all Middle Eastern countries should have a say. So he started this League Against Imperialism, and it failed after a few years. But it also served as a blueprint for Nehru's non-aligned policy when India finally got independence. In fact, it was acknowledged by, I think it was the Indonesian president Sukarno, but Nehru never acknowledged it in person. But many other people said that the League Against Imperialism was the precursor for the non-aligned movement. So that is in itself quite a powerful thing. I especially think of Chatto when I look at the state of the UN today, and the way you know every country in the world is allowing Israel to flatten Palestine with absolutely nothing to say about it, including India. So I think about that. Where is the voice of the little nation, of the colonized nation, of the nation that is not powerful? And with Roy had a great deal of influence. Roy was one of the founders of the Indian Communist Party, and he had a great deal of influence on many early communists and trade union leaders, including S.A. Dange, Maniben Kara, V.B. Karnik, all these early people who started the early trade unions and helped influence and formulate early labor laws, after India got independence, and were united for the mill worker, for the peasant, for the railway worker. And all this he had a lot of influence on. We just don't really remember it today. Maybe in West Bengal they remember him more. But then he became persona non grata for the communists as well. So that part of him was also erased. So they just both had a talent for always pursuing doomed causes, That was the thing. They always picked the wrong horse. So
Yeah, I had a guest on my show once who described himself as a patron saint of lost causes, and that sounds exactly like these two guys. And there's a beautiful scene in your book which, if the web series comes out, I think it would even make for a best first scene of the whole web series to set the tone, which is, Nehru at Roy's bedside when Roy is dying in 1953, and he says something to the effect of, Roy, get up, we have a lot of work to do together. And what you've also eloquently written about is the way Roy's views principles change with time. It wasn't that he was an impractical man who dogmatically held on to prior beliefs, but at
Yeah.
one point you write, quote, he now saw that the individual had been crushed by Stalin's move towards collectivism. So he began to see
Yes.
individual freedom as all important and began to formulate a new philosophy. His basic principle was that man is essentially rational and man is a maker of this world. It went beyond the narrow confines of nationalism, religion, and community, or at least it hoped to. Roy explained his new philosophy with 22 theses, all based on the fundamental principle that the individual was above society and freedom can only be enjoyed by individuals. He completely rejected Soviet collectivism. Stop quote. And in the next page, you write, Nehru was the only other Indian leader who had an international outlook, but Roy's philosophy was different from Nehru's too. Nehru believed that India's backwardness was due to foreign subjugation. Roy believed that it was India's backwardness that had led to subjugation. Nehru believed that the
Yes.
difference between a poor India and a rich Europe was the Industrial Revolution. Roy laid more emphasis on Renaissance and the Enlightenment and sought a similar Renaissance in India, stop quote. Which is when I begin to think what a tragedy it is that he didn't, live a few more years and get to argue with these ideas, and, the argument could play out in the public discourse, and all of that never happened. Give me a sense, actually, since, one of the things that your book is for me also is that it feels like an extended road movie because both these characters are just on the road all the time. Grand adventures are happening.
Yes.
And this road is the 20th century. It's crazy. Such a great,
Yes.
grand sweep of things that are happening. So I won't ask you to take me through details of your book and all of that, but give me a sense of these two different journeys that Chatto and Roy are on. That what is it that Chatto is trying to do when he's traveling all across the world, and when Roy is out of the country for 16 years, etc., etc., he comes back, he goes back. What is it that Roy is trying to do? What's going on? What's the game there?
So I wish it could become a web series or a road movie, because with Lady Doctors, there was interest in turning it into a series. It never happened. Okay, there were some big names and it all just fell through for various reasons. I would love this to be a road movie because it's very cinematic. And I don't know if you noticed this. I noticed this after I had written the whole book. The opening scene where Chatto is facing a firing squad in Moscow, which is during Stalin's Great Purge. He's facing a firing squad. It actually mirrors the opening of a very famous book, which I didn't realize until I had written the whole thing. It was published. It mirrors the opening scene of 100 Years of Solitude by Marquez, because the first scene line of that is something like, when Colonel Aurelio Buendia was facing the firing squad, he remembered the day his father took him to see ice. And I opened my book the same way, with Chatto standing in front of a firing squad. That we know happened. And then I have some conjecture as to what he was thinking when he was facing the firing squad. And this is just my, conjecture. I surmise that he must have been thinking about his family, his many lovers, and possibly of Emin Roy, who had just escaped the Soviet Union then, you know. So Chatto's journey started life in this genteel, educated, intellectual family with his 7 siblings in Hyderabad, moved to the UK, moved to England ostensibly to study, immediately got swept up in the happenings in India House, became steadily more radical, was influenced by Savarkar, Dhingra, Madam Kama, all the other MPT Acharya, all these revolutionaries, then had to flee to Paris to escape the British Secret Service, where he moved around in the Paris Indians, who were a bunch of revolutionaries, and completely took the radical path. Then moved to Berlin, where he became the head of a small group of people called the Berlin Indians. And once again, they were completely radical. During this time, he became influenced by communism, and he also started working with the Germans for what was called a jihad, because the Germans at the time wanted to mobilize the Muslim peoples of the world against the British. And there was all kinds of shenanigans there by a man called Baron Max von Oppenheim, who was also an archaeologist and who also dug up, a lot of things in Iraq. And eventually, again, that came to nothing. And once again, dissension and disorganization within the revolutionaries. Plus, I should mention that throughout, both Chatto and Roy had the problem that nobody actually believed that Indians could be independent. Even the Germans, while they were willing to aid them in some way by giving, small sums of money and helping them organize, they just did not believe that India could become completely independent. That's where the racism comes in. And they felt like, they would go so far and no further. So they would give a little bit of money and no further. And Chatto at this time also met a number of socialists who were very keen, Swedish, Dutch, who were very keen that India move to socialism. But when asked, well, we also want independence, then they would say, no, no, no. I mean, let's have socialism first, then maybe independence if you show yourself qualified. So Chatto, he was continually meeting these, sort of obstacles. Okay. Then Chatto met Agnes Smedley in Berlin. They had, for some years, they had this very toxic relationship, and then she finally left. And then Chatto was in Sweden, and where he did put out a lot of propaganda and, a lot of documents and tried other things. And he also started a league against imperialism. And eventually, after many, many years of this, he eventually had no choice but to flee to the Soviet Union because the police were on his tail in every other country, and Berlin had been taken over by the Nazis. And by the way, Hitler, despite being, fighting a war against the British, also had a very poor opinion of Indian nationalists. Being, the Aryan that he was, he did not believe that India deserved independence. And he said, I would rather actually, join cause with Britain than with India, with the Indian nationalists. So Chatto had no choice but to flee to the Soviet Union, which is where he became a friend of Kirov, who was, a confidant of Stalin. And there he appears to have given up the revolutionary life and he became an academic. He married a Russian woman. And possibly for the first time in his life, he had peace and quiet for a few years. And then suddenly Stalin's Great Purge started with no warning, with no rationale even, because it was sort of all encompassing. Stalin started to arrest every kind of foreigner. As I say in the book, he arrested people for the flimsiest reasons, for being a foreigner, for writing a letter, for dancing, for singing, for anything, And then I think Chatto knew his fate, because when his friends started being arrested, he says, I'm next. And then all we don't know anything further. All we know is that he was taken to he was executed in 1937, but his true fate was not known until 1991. In fact, Stalin's own Great Purge was exposed only by Nikita Khrushchev in 1956, 3 years after Stalin had died. So that was Chatto's trajectory, and he kind of stuck to one philosophy. First, it was revolution, then it was communism. He stuck to that. He died a communist, which is very ironic that a communist should be executed by Stalin. But that was what Stalin's Great Purge was all about, if you read further. Emin Roy had a different kind of trajectory, and Emin Roy died in 1954. So he had 17 more years than Chatto. Chatto died in 1937. So Emin Roy started life as a bomb thrower, as a revolutionary. He was very influenced by all the robust Bengali nationalists like Vivekananda, Aurobindo Ghosh, Bhaga Jatin, Jatindranath Mukherjee. So he started life as a revolutionary and as a bomb thrower, throwing bombs at British officials, British institutions, British things like that. And then he was told by Bhaga Jatin to go to the Far East to gather money and arms for India. And once again, he went to Japan, he went to Java, he went to China. He tried to make alliances, but ultimately failed. In fact, he calls it In Search of the Golden Fleece, after, the Jason and the Argonaut story where he's forever searching for the Golden Fleece. He failed for many reasons, but certainly one reason was that many nations were not willing to support India in their fight for independence. They believed that India could never be independent because, after all, it was a jewel in the crown. So the Britain would never give it up. Then Roy flees the police and is forced to go to the US, where he meets many, people from the Gadar movement, and also he meets Lala Lajpat Rai. And there is where Roy sort of changes his thinking, because he hears Lala Lajpat Rai constantly talk about freedom for India. And then he asks Lala Lajpat Rai, he says, okay, what if we get freedom? Won't we just be turning India over to the big zamindars and the big banyas and big business and the wealthy? What happens to the common man? And Lala Lajpat Rai did not have a convincing answer. He said, no, we first have to get independence. But Roy felt that if India is liberated only to be turned over to Gandhi and his ilk, it's not worth the. It's not. We're not going to be a fully independent India. Before this, he moved to Mexico. Again, he had to flee the police. He moved to Mexico, where Roy actually set up the Mexican Communist Party, which is very strange. Like an Indian who did not speak Spanish setting up the Mexican Communist Party. And by all accounts, it was a tiny party. Like, I think somebody described it as six men and a calico cat. So, like a book club. But nevertheless, it was the only communist party outside the Soviet Union. By this time, Roy had been influenced by, the Russian Revolution, and he was determined that he had moved to communism. That was his philosophy, and he realized that throwing bombs only gets you so far. You need a philosophy to liberate an entire people. Then he moves to the Soviet Union, where he becomes Lenin's protege. He is meets Trotsky, he meets Stalin. He is given many tasks by the Communist Party and embarks on some very foolhardy missions, all of which fail for different reasons. One reason could be that he was set up to fail. It could also be that he circumstances were not favorable, and thirdly, it could also be Roy's just natural arrogance, because he was quite an arrogant man from reading his memoir. And eventually the Communist Party expels him because he doesn't agree with their philosophies anymore. Returns to India. He is imprisoned for 6 years. When he comes out, he joins the Congress, but in the Congress he can't get along with Gandhi and Nehru, so he leaves them and he sets up the Radical Humanist Party. And I must read Roy's obituary, which will probably enrage his disciples, okay, but it's more nuanced in the book. And a Guardian obituary describes him as having, Emin Roy, as having the most extraordinary career of a man of his generation in Asia. It was of interest out of proportion to his actual achievements. And in a way, that's true, because he had such a fascinating life, but in many ways, it did not come to that much. And the reason is he had little skill in party maneuver, which is, I think, a damning indictment in India, because the thing that you need most of all is skill in party maneuver. So,
Yeah, absolutely. My God, what a potted history. I would just tell all my readers to go out and buy your book because it's like 800 times richer than this. But I'm not done yet. I was just thinking if it was a web series, like every episode should have a great scene with which it opens so you can't leave it. And another of the great scenes in your book comes from Bhaga Jatin, where Bhaga Jatin is fighting with
yes.
that tiger. Like he's basically called to a town and he's told there's a tiger, come and kill it. He thinks it's a baby tiger. He goes, it's a full-fledged man-eating bugger. The man-eating tiger and Bhaga
And,
Jatin fight hand to hand. Bhaga Jatin wins, but his limbs are mauled. And
hmm,
then
and
villagers come, they think he's going to die, but he survives, and that's where
yeah,
he gets a name from, which is such a
yes.
fascinating story.
Yeah. I mean, there were so many fascinating careers in around at that time. And, it's just, I mean, somebody asked me the question the other day. This was in an, I gave a talk at Takshashila, which you know about, and they said, do all these people, they have all different views. Is that something that's lacking in today's society? And I think one thing that people of that time had was they met in person and they had so many great conversations, as opposed to just logging onto social media and getting all your opinions from there. And they read so much. For instance, Emin Roy had quite a patchy and poor education because he was busy being a revolutionary in his times when he should have been studying, and he educated himself by reading in a New York public library. And if you read the way Emin Roy writes, he's written about some 40 books or whatever, and he writes so well with a certain little full of himself, but nevertheless so much better than we are writing now with all our advantages. Like, you talk about the art of clear writing. I feel like these guys had so much, they were so vastly read and they had so much erudition, which I think these days is sort of dying out because everything is a soundbite, or a tweet. So,
Yeah, and another thing that you kind of realize when one reads books such as yours is that there are, all of these little nuggets about places in history where you think that, that, oh my God, this is something I never knew about. And in the moment, to the protagonists, it must have seemed absolutely wild. Like one thing that I didn't know till I read your book was about the provisional government set up in Afghanistan in 1915, and it was headed by a guy called Raja Mahendra Pratap of Hathras, right?
Yes, yes. And yeah, I mean, at least they took him to head it, and then and then Lenin said, "We, I don't want this, guy, whatever this fake prince or whatever." It's just wild, the things that. Another really wild thing is the way Emin Roy was roped in to smuggle the Russian crown jewels.
Yeah.
And which were the crown jewels which were taken from the dead bodies of the Romanovs in the, they were all bayoneted and shot. And then, the Russian crown jewels, he was roped in, but I couldn't find any trace of what happened to them later. I think honestly they have been, appropriated by somebody or lying somewhere or the other. Some are in the Russian museums, but not all. And they just do such incredible things. Like, even that there's that scene where Emin Roy is sent to Tashkent with a wagon full of gold and, lots of machine guns and this that to start a revolution there by the Comintern. And it, of course, it doesn't work out. Many things that he did not work out. So, but still, the very fact that he was actually sent is like, it's like bizarre, the fact that people don't know about this. And I feel like so much of Emin Roy has been reduced to like dull communist philosophy, and everybody's like, oh my god, I don't want to read about communist philosophy, I need my iPhone, kind of thing. But there is lots of human stuff as well, you know
No, and there's that Mad China episode also where Emin Roy and Borodin and someone else are sent to China to foment a revolution
yes.
over there. And then
Yeah.
Stalin gives them an order which is completely impractical and impossible, but no one can dare to tell Stalin that. And everything basically goes to
Yeah.
hell. And when Emin Roy gets back, he finds that he
Correct.
is persona non grata.
Yeah, I do believe that. I feel like Emin Roy deserves a book on his own, and I do believe that there is a book coming. I've heard about it. So everybody should read that book as well, because this man deserves a book on his own. I have structured my book this way because, this is the kind of book I wanted to write, but he deserves a popular history or, not a scholarly history on his own,
He has got an excellent popular history. It is a book that you have written, and in a sense, a key part of the book, and therefore also the web series, which will surely happen, is about these two characters actually being in the same place at the same time, actually interacting in the early 1920s, where they are fighting for Lenin's favor. But Emin Roy is already there
Yes.
first, and then Chatto
Yes.
lands up with
Yes.
Agnes, and Agnes has prior beef with Emin Roy, and Emin Roy is ranting against Agnes. Agnes is ranting against Emin Roy. Emin Roy is ranting against Chatto. Chatto is ranting against Emin Roy. Chatto hates Borodin, etc., etc. Great drama is happening. Tell me about that period, because it strikes me that under slightly different circumstance, these guys would be chaddi buddies. They would be bum chums because they would be so good
Correct.
together.
Totally. Yes, like, like Starsky and Hutch or whatever, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They totally, yeah. Actually, they don't meet until 1920, but they hear of each other because it's a small and interconnected world. And they are fighting for a very tiny piece of the pie, which is, by that time both of them had decided that the Bolsheviks, where it's at. And we forget so many years later, perhaps we all know that, we don't venerate Lenin. But at the time, Lenin was, many Indians venerated Lenin because he had liberated the country from the aristocrats. He had fought back the British and the Germans. And then later they venerated Stalin because Stalin, fought back the Nazis with the Red Army. So at the both Chatto and Roy were very much impressed by Lenin, and they wanted his patronage, his help, his support, his perhaps funds, perhaps soldiers, anything. And they were both fighting for this, and Roy won. And if you Google Emin Roy, sadly, I could not have any pictures in the book because it drives up the cost of the book. Emin Roy was a very, very charismatic, good looking, film star good looks, he's described as having, and very, very charismatic man. Everything that everybody says about it was that when he walked into the room, everybody else stopped talking. Okay, he was that kind of man. And I feel like this might have played a part, okay, because, but also because Emin Roy was mentored by Mikhail Borodin, who was a very close friend of Lenin. So Emin Roy got to Moscow first and met Lenin and got his oar in first and had already, spoken with Lenin. And by the time poor Chatto made it from Berlin with Agnes Smedley, he was sort of completely ignored. In fact, Lenin just said, "Send me your thesis." Yeah, okay, I've read your thesis. And the relationship between the triangle of Agnes Smedley, Chatto, and Roy is fascinating. And it's hard to know what exactly it is because Agnes Smedley had met Emin Roy in New York way before she met Chatto in Berlin. And he was married by then. But later, Emin Roy has this almost very strange hatred of her. Hatred is the word I would use because he calls her an evil witch, a temptress, and all kinds of things. And he says that if not for her, I could have got along very well with Chatto because after all, we're fighting for the same cause. Now, the interesting thing is that Agnes Medley wrote a novel called Daughters of Earth, which was a fictionalized version of her life. And in that, the heroine, who is basically Agnes herself, is raped by an Indian nationalist. And she does not reveal the identity of the nationalist. It's a sort of composite of many characters, but one biographer of Agnes suddenly has claimed that it could be Emin Roy. And honestly, I couldn't find any evidence as to this. So I don't want to say anything. But I think what is fact is that Emin Roy really despised Agnes Medley, and this is part of the very macho nationalist culture amongst Indian revolutionaries, where Agnes Medley and Chatto were not married, so she was seen as his keep or his, his whore or whatever, and she never got the respect that she deserved. To be fair, Agnes Medley also had a lot going on. She had mental issues. She had, and she was quite a neurotic person in many ways. And she also had some issues going on. So it's very hard to sort of sift through all this to see who was at fault. But what is certain is that Roy despised Agnes Medley and Agnes Medley despised Roy because of their past history or because of whatever reason. And Roy, very cunningly outmaneuvered Chatto and managed to get the communist support. And Chatto and Agnes Medley had to return to Berlin. Agnes Medley wasn't even allowed to speak, and they had to return to Berlin empty-handed, which was actually sort of the beginning of the end for Chatto and his future plans. And Emin Roy, rose to the top ranks of international communism. He was a friend of Stalin. He was met with Trotsky. He was the Comintern's man in China, all these things. And of course, that didn't work out well for him. But it's really exciting, all those scenes with all these men. And one of the men who went was also Swami Vivekananda's brother. So he also was trying to get his oar in. And also MPT Acharya, who later, died very sadly in complete penury in India. There's a book about him as well. He's also a fascinating character. So,
Yeah, and you point out in your book that the leader Smedley was possibly referring to as a rapist was Harambalal Gupta, and Harambalal Gupta
yes,
later lands up at a Communist Party meeting and says there's no place for foreigners
yes,
and women, and basically he doesn't want her there. And
correct.
I'm just imagining her mental state at being around all these toxic men, some of whom allegedly
Yes,
committed violence on her, and what hell it must have been. And I also wonder when you look at history, like in today's modern times, we have discussed about how, on social media it's fashionable to pass judgment on everyone and, retrospectively cancel people. But if you think about it, everybody's getting cancelled. If you start, picking
yeah,
flaws, like at some level you have to separate art and artist and so on and so forth. Like there's
true,
absolutely no man in this book who's not deeply unsavory. And if you really want to pick them out, you can look at Gandhi and Nehru and so on. I mean, people contain multitudes
true.
and so on and so forth. And is this is this what like this is what draws me to history actually, the human side of it,
Yes,
and
yes.
is this why you were drawn to history to begin with, and is this a sense that you get among your readers as well? Like, is one of the reasons Lady Doctors worked so well and this book I know will be a bestseller, is this, and like Manu's books or Ram's books, because they people them with actual complex human beings, and that's what makes it so worth it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, nobody in history is black or white. I mean, the problem is, like I said, that our textbooks flatten them into, as we all know, Gandhi was by no means a saint. Neither was Nehru. Neither was Tilak. None of these people were saints. They were human. And we are also human, which means that we also have all these flaws, and yes, it's certainly what drew me to history, which is that every single historical character has so many flaws and messes up and tries again and then messes up again, which is what it is to be human, really. So completely, yes, true. And I try to find characters which have all these facets to them, and which are I attempt at least to not put them on a pedestal.
So let's talk about casting now. Who should play these characters in the web series?
My goodness, you have given this a lot of thought.
No, no,
Yeah.
I'm asking you to give it
I
a
have
lot of
no
thought.
idea. I have no
First name
idea.
that comes to your head. Who should
I
be
mean,
Chatto?
if Shaumitra Chatterjee were alive, he would have made such a good Emin Roy, I
Totally,
feel.
totally.
Okay, I have no idea because for some time now I have like not watched any of these. Chatto, I don't know. You need like a small, slight man with a bristling mustache. You tell me. I mean, who could be cast as Chatto?
I mean,
No idea at all.
yeah, I mean, not as leaving aside the small man and the bristling mustache. I looked at a couple of pictures of Chatto online, and I thought that that's sort of the complexity of the character requires someone like a Manoj Bajpayee to do justice to it.
Maybe Manoj Bajpayee.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, maybe Manoj Bajpayee. I think definitely. And I don't know. I feel for Agnes Medley, I have a person in mind. Okay. And being the deracinated person that I am, all these foreign actors are leaping out at me. So I'm just going to mention. For Agnes Medley, I would like Carrie Coon. She's a character actor who's in a series called The Gilded Age, and she's in The White Lotus, and she's in various other things. And she just has this chameleon like character where I think she could really kind of pull it off. She's American as well. I think for Emin Roy, we have to find a current actor, somebody with like a lot of charisma.
I have a suggestion
uh,
which will seem odd to
yeah.
people because this particular actor hasn't done roles with this range yet, but I feel he's capable of it. I would go for Ranveer Singh. You know, the good looks, the charisma, and he's a tremendous actor. And to, give him a challenge like this that you age over 40 years and all of that would be very interesting.
Yeah, I guess. But first let it become a series, then we'll talk about casting.
We got to.
Lady Doctors almost made it. It made it to the signing of contract stage, and then it all fell through. So I don't want to say anything about this ever becoming a series. And I don't know, it might be a mixed blessing because that Kesari 2 is getting some savage reviews as well as praise, and I don't know whether it's accurate to the book. I haven't, to be honest, read the book, though actually it's on my list because I do want to read the book. I think the book came out in 2020 or 2019 possibly, I don't know. So the book is quite it's not recent. So adaptations can also be a mixed blessing, I guess.
No, 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 no.
So
But what can go wrong? What can go wrong is if it's not a good series, people will say the book was much better, which is good for you. And if it's a good series, people will say, we must go and read the book, which is good for you. We must manifest. So
okay, let's manifest.
my third to last question, since I've taken a lot of your time, tell me about the role one important protagonist played in the writing of the book, which you haven't spoken about so far, but you mentioned in your book, which is Fleetwood Mac.
Yes. Yeah, it's acknowledgements. Okay. I think this may be the first book that I have not acknowledged to my father, because all my other books I acknowledged to my father. This book, I felt like I really needed to acknowledge the libraries and librarians because they're really being sort of decimated. And of course, in India, no libraries at all. But my library here in under Tory Britain, well, previously Tory Britain, now it's not. It is converted into a visa center. Half of it has been converted into a visa center. My local library here. So yeah, Fleetwood Mac. So yeah, when you're writing books, you need music, but you're not music that disturbs you too much or makes you, stressed. So I think the Rumors album, Fleetwood Mac, is the best album ever. And I'm also very fascinated by the dynamics in that group. So that's why it's dedicated to Fleetwood Mac, because I listened to that album some, I don't know, 1,000 times while writing this book.
Yeah,
So
and the relationships in that band were plenty complicated as well. So,
very plenty complicated, and yeah, I find myself fascinated by them as well. Not just the music, everything about the band is very interesting to me.
all my writing
So
students are just face palming because two writers just use the phrase very plenty complicated, but it's okay. You can sometimes. You got to be authentic to your feelings.
oh God,
So,
I think think I have said far worse things on this podcast than very plenty
yeah,
complicated.
yeah.
It's like it's whatever comes out, Yeah.
So my penultimate question, and I'm so impressed that you wrote this book in 15 months, and of course a few months before that to do the design for it. I'm curious about how you look at your life now in terms of life design. Like I was chatting with a friend of mine who's in his 40s who finished his first book. He said that he's realized that it takes him 6 7 years to write a book, so he's really got to choose carefully, and he already into panic mode because hey, he's got to choose carefully and time is running out. How do do you think in terms of how much time there is, or do you just say that I love writing, I'll keep on writing, I won't look too far into the future, I'll just do what I do? So when you look at your life design, how do you think about it, and what are you working on now?
My life has not been very designed. I started life trying to design it in my 20s, and then everything went completely unplanned for many reasons. Okay, those who people who know me personally will know what I mean. And then I try to kind of yank it back on course. And a lot of thing has just been complete serendipity, nothing that I planned. For instance, I moved to London in 2020, and it is only because of the British Library and access to British Library that I started writing these books. And this was not planned. It just happened out of the blue. And moving to a different country in the pandemic is probably not something that many would have done, but we did it. And I'm now in my 50s. So, more of my life has gone than is ahead of me. I do feel a sense of rushing time, and that time is running out to do all the things that I want to do. And therefore, I try to do everything pretty fast. You know, I don't know, it's great to spend 6 or 7 years on a book, but I don't know whether having started quite late. I wrote my first book when I was 42. So I'm a very late bloomer. I think I've said that in the last previous podcast as well. I'm a very late bloomer. I have bloomed very late, and therefore I need to rush a bit because I do not know what's going to happen in my future. And for because of that, I try to pack a lot into my life, and I have the time and the space, and very, you know, luckily I have some financial backing that I can pack a lot into my life. So I'm trying to pack as much into my life as possible. And I know that a lot of people in their 50s have gone the other way. They were like want to slow down and that kind of thing. They become more sort of, but I have gone the other way. I'm like, there is so much of life to grab. That sounds very pompous and influencer type things. But it is true though. I mean, there are just so many things that I want to do, so many things I want to see, so many people I want to meet. And so I've gone the other way. Actually, I have, instead of becoming reclusive and inward looking, I've kind of gone the other way in my 50s. And but having said that, every book I write, this is my fourth book. People think it's my second book, but I did write two books before. I feel like I don't want to write any more books. I feel very sort of fed up, and I'm like, oh my God, the rewards, the monetary rewards are tiny, and then who will read, and etc. etc. I keep thinking that, but then I find a story, and then I think about another book. And on this book tour, people were asking me, what's your next book? And I said, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. But then halfway through the book tour, I got an idea for a book because I was reading and I got an idea. And who knows, I may or may not pursue it. I think the next thing that I want to do, since I'm in the UK, I want to write a book that British people will want to read. And that is incredibly, incredibly difficult for an Indian writer who is not a British Indian. And Lady Doctors was published in the UK, and some British people read it. It was in the bookshops, which is a huge achievement, but it didn't get any reviews in the papers, and not many people have read it because it's so hard to explain Indian context to anybody. For instance, this is just an example of how difficult it is to break that wall, like the fourth wall or whatever. I was talking to a British Indian about my book. And she said, "What's it about?" And I said, "It's about Sarojini Naidu's brother." And then after a while, she said, "Did you know that I am named after Sarojini Naidu?" And I said, "No." And then she said, "Yeah, my name is Ginny. I knew her as Ginny, but it's actually a short form for Sarojini." And she said, "But I don't know who Sarojini Naidu is. I have never known. Nobody ever told me. They just called me Sarojini, and the minute I was born, I shortened it to Ginny because nobody could pronounce Sarojini." So this is how hard it is to get a book published and to appeal to the British audience, because they don't know the context. They only know Gandhi and Nehru, and even that you have to explain that Mahatma Gandhi is not related to Indira Gandhi, and they don't know anything else. And that I find very frustrating, because we read so much Western history, we read so much American history, and we read all about American states. We know where Poughkeepsie is, we know where Massachusetts is, but they do not know anything. The flow of knowledge is only one way, and this is the kind of wall that every Indian writer has to fight in the West, which is to get people to read your book. And if you don't know anything, you know, you can Google what is Maharashtra or Karnataka. Why do I need to explain, these things to you? But, people don't see it that way. And this is why I would really like my next book to be read in the UK and reviewed in the UK. So that's my next goal, but it's going to be hard. However, the character that I have found is a character that lives in the UK, so maybe lived in the UK, so maybe it'll be easier. We'll see how it goes. Still very early days.
More power to you. I mean, I'd be optimistic. I think a great story is a great story anywhere, even if the names are unfamiliar and so on and so forth. Though I totally get what you're saying in the sense that I wish the publishing world was a little more open to new ideas and not just playing it too safe all the time, which is what I hear from so many of my writer friends abroad.
Yeah.
My final sort of question for me and my listeners, recommend books, films, music, any kind of art at all, which means a lot to you and which you love so much that you want to share with all the world.
Okay. My only thing is that I don't know whether they are all available
Oh,
in
don't worry
India
about it. We'll
on,
find a way to get
we,
it. The Jugaru
we'll
Indian.
figure it out too. Jugaru through VPNs or something. So the two books that I wanted to talk about were, I said, The Patient Assassin, Anita Anand, Rama Bhima Soma by Shrikar. I've forgotten his second name. I think that's Shrikar first name. Sorry, Shrikar, if you're listening. Okay. And also, I still haven't finished this book, but I have read parts of it which are fantastic, and I'm going to read more. I stopped reading nonfiction while I was writing this book because it was getting in my way. The third nonfiction book I would really love to recommend is The Day I Became a Runner by Shohini Chattopadhyay, which is fantastic about India's early women runners, and it's beautifully written, so lyrically and beautifully written. Then I think about fiction on this subject that you said about Indian or Asian writers writing in the West. I'd like to recommend this book, this novel that I read recently. It's by it's called Brotherless Night by V.V. Ganesh Nandan, who is a Sri Lankan writer of Sri Lankan origin. It's about the Sri Lankan Civil War. And honestly, when I picked it up, I was like, oh my God, there's enough war in the world. I don't want to read something depressing. And I didn't want to read it, but it's so beautifully written. And one thing that VV Ganesh Nandan does is she does not explain the Tamil terms. So it's scattered with Tamil terms which are actually quite understandable to any Indian person, like rasam, lungi, pongal, and all that. But I read it in my in my very white book club, and they're like, "What the hell are these? All these terms, and why do they have these complicated names?" The names are actually not at all complicated. They are names like Shashidharan and Niranjan, which are very identifiable, but it just gave me an idea of how it is so hard to make a Western reader read about a person called Shashidharan or Shashikala, and yet we are expected to read about Western characters called Alexander and Catherine and Bartholomew and God knows what else. So I think this book is just amazing. It's written in a way that is not manipulative, and of course, terrible, sad things happen, and it's probably very identifiable to 80s kids or people who grew up in the 80s, because it's all the events, of the LTT, Prabhakaran, and all those events that led to where we are today. So that's a great book, Brotherless Night, V.V. Ganeshanathan. In TV, I have really liked something called Miss Austen, which is about the letters of Jane Austen, which is on the BBC. I don't know whether people can easily watch it, but it starts very slow, but it's very beautiful and memorable, about Jane Austen and her sister. And I also really loved Wolf Hall, which is obviously the adaptation of Hilary Mantel's novel, series 2. And a lot of people will find both these very slow and very dull, so but I find them fascinating. But for more fun content, I am completely addicted to this TV show called The Traitors, and they have the British version, American version, New Zealand version. It's like mafia. It's a reality game show where people sort of try to find the identity of the traitor. So that got me through the whole winter, watching British, US, New Zealand versions and all of those. It's like a really fun game show to watch, and it just teaches you about psychology and people, because generally the first person to be voted out, it's like a voting out game, is always a South Asian man. Always. They always think like, oh, he's too know it all, he's too clever, he's a doctor, oh my god, he's too clever, he's a lawyer, engineer. They vote him out. Music wise, I think I'm extremely stuck in the 70s or 80s, so nobody wants my music recommendations. I just keep listening to the same music from the 70s and the 80s, Fleetwood Mac type of music again and again and again. Sadly, I haven't moved beyond that, really. So that's it.
Yep. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for writing the book. Firstly, I mean, when I learned a new book of yours had come out, I knew it would rock and roll because Lady Doctors was so good, and this did not disappoint me at all. It was fantastic. I shall wait for the web series to come out, and then we will all party and celebrate across continents. So, Kavita, thanks.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you very much for having me. I really wanted to come on because, like I said, every single person I met on my book tour said, I heard about Lady Doctors on the Seen and the Unseen. And, that's how I knew I had to kind of get back on this. So I sort of brazenly emailed you and said, please have me on, And I'm glad you liked the book, because there was a certain amount of pressure to make this book as good as Lady Doctors. And it's a different book, but I feel like it has some of the things that made Lady Doctor successful. Basically, the humanity in people. You know, that's what it is, really.
Absolutely.
Thank you
It's a
again.
fantastic book, and you will hear from many people about how much they love it. Thank you.
I hope so. Thank you. Bye bye.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. You can follow Kavita on Twitter at Kavita Rao, that's one word. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Verma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in and any podcast app of your choice. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.